Insomniac Spider-Man 2 was a game that had an insurmountable level of hype building towards its release. I know for me it was my most anticipated game of the year. Now that I've gotten it to 100% completion, I can safely give my opinions on it. So, did it live up to expectations? Did it fix all the stuff I complained about in an earlier video? How's their interpretation of Venom? Well, you're gonna have to watch the video to find out. I will be spoiling literally everything about this game, so you'll have to come back to this later if that's an issue for you. But for those of you that are still here, let's get into it. Like all of Sony's exclusive games, Spider-Man 2 is a primarily narrative-driven game built around its main campaign. That's why I think it makes the most sense to not start with that. Spider-Man 2's Traversal is, as you'd expect, built off the foundation of the previous games. When I made a video talking about what Insomniac Spider-Man sequel needed to improve upon, I didn't suggest too many changes for the Traversal. Really all I wanted was to smooth over many of the aspects of the first game's Traversal and nothing more. I did not suggest adding web wings because I didn't want them. I did not suggest adding an option to change the web swinging's functionality to make it more challenging because I thought it would be too difficult to implement. So this game includes both of these features, and they fundamentally change Traversal in a way that makes this game far more fun, challenging, and rewarding than either of Insomniac's previous outings. Turning swing assist off makes it so that the swing becomes more based on physics. The Spider-Men are now pulled more towards the buildings their web's attached to, so you actually have to steer yourself. Swinging too low to the ground will cause the web line to break once Spider-Man connects with the floor or a car. The hover boot swinging is still in this game. Unfortunately, Spider-Man does not run along the ground when he gets too close to it, but with swing assist off, he just slams into the ground when he gets too close, so the floating issue has been somewhat solved. Fall damage is another thing that can add difficulty to the swinging, but I find that it's largely unnecessary. Having your swinging interrupted by colliding with the ground is, in my opinion, inadequate punishment for screwing up, and I think taking damage on top of that is just kinda silly. And you can take full damage from heights that don't seem that high. Just doing the charge jump will get you high enough to take damage, but the option is there if you want it. What matters is that players can now choose to make swinging more of a challenge. You have to think about your direction and when to shoot out a web, or if you even should shoot out a web, because you also have another option now, the web wings. The main reason I didn't want web wings in the sequel was that I didn't see the point of them. The swinging in 2018 and Miles Morales was so automated that it basically already was flying. The web wings would be largely redundant, just another way to move forward in a game where you already have a perfectly functional way to move forward. But with swing assist turned off, I find that the web wings now have a legitimate reason to exist. The web wings don't rely on the buildings around you, so you have more control over them when moving forward. This is especially helpful in the new playable area that has much smaller buildings that are harder to swing from. And while it is easy to glide continuously like you're flying, it's still best to web swing every now and then to gain altitude and speed. God, do you build speed in this game. Something that is immediately noticeable when first playing this game is how much faster the web swinging is. Even the more basic maneuvers you could pull off in previous games grant far more speed here than they did before. It's a challenge to keep this speed and not awkwardly crash into things, even with swing assist turned on, though the web wings do kind of circumvent this, especially the full damage, as you will never take full damage when you have the web wings out, even if you shoot directly into the ground at a million miles an hour. As long as you have the web wings out, nothing happens. There are other additions here as well. There's a corner tether that allows you to quickly turn corners, which is neat, I guess. I didn't find myself using this one too much until the end of my time with the game. Once I got the hang of it, I used it more, and I think it's cool, but it isn't the biggest or most game-changing addition. There's also the ability to do a loop-de-loop, which is another great new movement option. It takes a bit of getting used to, but once you get the hang of it, it's a great way to gain height or speed while swinging. And of course, it looks and feels cool. And then there's the slingshot, which is fantastic. It feels so good to be able to shoot yourself forward from literally any point on the map. People have said that the first two games feel difficult to come back to after playing this one, but I don't really agree with that. However, the absence of the slingshot is the one thing that actually bothers me when going back to Miles Morales or 2018. It's that fun, and is in my opinion the single greatest addition to this game. The charge jump is now part of the Spider-Man's starting kit, and you can do it from perch points now too. That's something I asked for, so checking that off the list. The animation for it has been changed though, and oh my god, it's so bad. It's not that it's ugly or poorly animated, it's just, it looks so silly. Why is he shaking like that? I understand that they want to convey that he's barely restraining his power before he blasts off, but Christ, this is going way too far. The original animation was better, there was honestly no need to change it. The trick system returns here in its revamped form seen in Miles Morales, this time for both characters. I don't really care about tricks too much, they're neat, I guess, but I rarely ever use them. The aerial abilities from Miles Morales return here, allowing you to go directly upwards or shoot forwards while in the air. These are alright, and it technically solves one of the issues I had with the first game, but I still don't love them. These abilities being on a timer is kind of annoying since you can't use them freely, but I mostly just wanted a way to consistently move upwards while in the air. Just like the first game, there aren't many areas where this is an issue, but there are some challenge missions where I got a little pissed off that I couldn't go upwards while airborne. And the ability that moves you forward, I don't know, I think that one's kind of pointless. We already have the web zip to move you forward in the air, and I know that this one moves faster, but I can't help but think that this ability could be scrapped and the web zip could just be made a bit stronger. These abilities are really my only actual complaint with this game's traversal, and it's honestly not that large of an issue, it's more a matter of preference. I have another thing that I'd want to see, but this isn't a complaint, more of a suggestion. We should be able to slingshot ourselves upwards while on the side of a building. Running up the sides of a building is still a little slow in this game, even with the generally increased speed of the traversal, so I'd like a faster way to do that, and I think it would look cool. Traversal gets a pretty damn good out of 10. On the surface, this game's combat is very similar to that of the original PS4 game. However, there are several changes, big and small, that change the system enough to be a different experience. Let's start with the Spider-Man's basic abilities. These are largely the same, so if you play the 2018 game or Miles Morales, then you'll immediately feel comfortable here. Some moves that had to be unlocked before, like the swing kick and ground pound, are default moves now, which is nice. But let's get to the new stuff. The web pull has been significantly improved and expanded on. It pulls enemies much closer to you, which is something that I asked for in my video, so that's cool. But there are also several other options with this move. You can instead choose to yank enemies left and right or slam them into the ground. The ability to yank an enemy's weapon out of their hand now has a specific input and a shorter throw animation, making it a far more useful option. Aerial combat has seen tweaks as well. You can now do the slide under move in the air, there's a follow-up to the swing kick that brings enemies even higher, and enemies can be bounced directly downwards. It's cool stuff, and while it doesn't completely change how combat functions, there's still fun additions to help diversify the combat experience. Next up are the gadgets, which have been completely overhauled. There's a different and smaller selection of gadgets this time around, and the gadget wheel is completely gone. Now, gadgets are activated by holding R1 and pressing one of the face buttons. Removing the wheel is something I'm mixed on. While it does allow for instant access to all your gadgets, it also means that you can't pull up the wheel for some cheap slowdown. Not gonna lie, I did abuse the hell out of that in the first game. Then there's the gadgets themselves. The upshot is a significantly weaker version of the suspension matrix, lifting fewer enemies into the air for a shorter amount of time. The concussion burst is the weaker child of the concussive blast. This one creates a small explosion of force that pushes enemies a bit instead of the hilariously overpowered force push. The web grabber is similar in concept to the trip mine, using web lines to pull enemies together. It affects more enemies than the trip mine, but it doesn't have the ability to instantly KO them. Finally, there's the ricochet web that is a weaker version of the web bomb. It has a much cooler animation, but its function of webbing up multiple enemies at once is the same. These gadgets are a mixed bag. The ricochet web is really cool, if a little unreliable due to the randomness of how it ricochets. The concussion burst is useful as well as looking and sounding cool. At least until the story changes it into the sonic burst, where it gets another sound effect at the end that's pretty bad. The web grabber is pretty good. Its ability to pull enemies together allows for you to follow up with another ability that hits in an area, at least until you get the upgrade that pulls in objects as well. The pulled objects push enemies away, which removes the grouping ability this gadget had. I don't want to say that this makes the gadget useless, because that's not true, but I do think it becomes less interesting. Then there's the one true stinker, the upshot. What the hell is this? I'm not talking gameplay here, I mean the actual gadget itself. It's a floating turret that once deployed shoots 3 laser beams that home in on their targets and then launch the poor bastard directly upwards no matter what angle they were struck from. This is worse than the suspension matrix. That thing was essentially a quirky spin on a grenade. It was simple and understandable despite its ill-fitting ability and inherent silliness. This, though, is far too complex in its construction and entirely nonsensical in its ability. At least the suspension matrix was an optional gadget that you didn't even have to unlock. This thing is the very first gadget you get, and the game forces you to unlock it. After I completed the story and became more comfortable with this game's combat, I found that this was the only gadget gadget I went out of my way to avoid using because of how silly I think it is. I saw on Twitter that someone suggested that it should have been a spider drone that hovers above enemies and pulls them up with web lines. It was probably Allfather Media that made the suggestion, but I honestly don't remember. The point is, that would have been a lot better, as it would be more in line with the Spider-Man character instead of feeling like a holdover from the Ratchet & Clank games. My favorite gadgets from the first game were the Impact Web, Trip Mine, and Web Bomb, so I'm disappointed and a little surprised that none of them returned for the sequel. These were the gadgets that I felt were the most appropriate for Spider-Man, since they were all web-based gadgets that expanded on, you know, Spider-Man's webs. The Web Bomb was pretty overpowered though, so I get cutting that one, but I think the other two could have worked here, the Trip Mine especially. Its absence is felt in stealth too, which I'll get to later, but I think it would have paired nicely with the new Directional Web Yank. The Directional Web Yank gives you so much more control over enemy positioning, so it's odd that the gadget that relied on enemy positioning didn't make it into this game. A common complaint of the first game was that the gadgets were too overpowered, allowing you to instantly take out enemies in a largely brain-dead fashion. I can't really dispute this, that's mostly what the gadgets were for, but it was fun. Most of the gadgets in that game were fun to use, and it was fun to figure out how you could combine them to wipe out enemies even more efficiently. There were also more options, so if you thought some gadgets were really lame and bad, looking at you guys, then you didn't have to use them. But that's not really the case here. It's clear that balance was a big priority when these gadgets were created, which is why they're a lot weaker. But this also comes at the cost of them being less useful and less fun to toy with. This is because you're supposed to combine them with the abilities, which I'll get into right now. The abilities are a new major addition to the Spider-Man's combat. Well, they're really only an addition for Peter, as all of Miles' Venom abilities return from his game, though they are reworked to fit into this game's new ability system. Abilities are activated by holding L1 and then pressing one of the face buttons, much like how the gadgets are used. Unlike the gadgets, which are limited resources and need to be refilled by KOing enemies, abilities are all on their own cooldown timers. These timers can be filled faster by attacking enemies and successfully dodging attacks, and there are upgrades to reduce the cooldown time further. And as you progress through the game, you'll unlock more alternate abilities for the different ability slots that give you more choice of what you can use. These abilities can be fun to use, their animations are usually very flashy and cool, but I can't say that it's all sunshine and rainbows. There's a lot to dislike here. The biggest issue I have with the abilities is how they're applied to Peter. He has two sets of abilities, the first being the mechanical spider arms and the second being the symbiote powers. The symbiote powers look great when you're using a symbiote suit, they look weird as hell otherwise, and once you beat the game you're stuck with the anti-venom version of these, so if you prefer the black color of the typical symbiote powers, then too bad. Getting back to the mechanical arms, I hate these things. The inclusion of the spider arms is entirely unnecessary, nonsensical, and worst of all, they're permanent. You can't take these off, they're a part of some of the finishers, Peter's movement abilities, and the parry. So if you don't like the arms, if you don't like an overly techie Spider-Man and want to play as a more traditional Spider-Man, then too bad, because you're stuck with them. People have defended these arms by saying that they make sense, but they don't. I think what people mean by this is that since Peter worked on Dr. Octopus's arms, these arms serve as the next step of that work. But I heavily disagree with that. When would Peter have found the time or money to work on these? And once he completed them, why didn't he sell that technology? That was literally the whole point of Octavius' original work, to make mechanical prostheses to help people and then sell them to make a profit off of it. That's why Peter signed on with him, and you're telling me that he finished his mentor's work and then sat on it? Even if you buy all of that, Peter is also able to upgrade these things to the point that they can materialize out of thin air? How? That's light years ahead of any other technology we see in this game, and Peter casually has this and is making no money off of it? This makes sense to you? Before you start to argue with me, you should consider that even the developers seem to think this is silly, as Peter rarely uses these arms in the story. They are never seen in another cutscene after the Sandman scenario, even though there are several situations where Peter really should have brought them out. It feels like there was a deliberate effort to downplay the arms' involvement narratively because they bring up too many questions otherwise. I know the next logical question here is, if you don't like the arms, then what should Peter have had instead? There are two different options you could take here. The first is that Peter has no abilities until he gains the symbiote. I don't like this one because it would make gameplay pretty boring, but I think it would fit the narrative better as the symbiote would feel a lot stronger once it's obtained and gives Peter new powers. The second option here is to give Peter more traditional abilities instead. Here's some ideas. For the ability on Square, give him the web bomb. Reuse the animation from the symbiote bomb move, but it's the web bomb he's throwing. If you don't like that, then another option would be for him to yank out some concrete and slam it into an enemy like what Spider-Man could do in Shattered Dimensions. For X, give him a rising uppercut like in Web of Shadows. I know some people think this might be boring, but I've always loved how fast, swift, and powerful this move felt in that game. To give this move a bit of zest to it, it could also stagger all surrounding enemies when it's used, something that Peter's uppercut in the first game could do but has been removed in this game. For Circle, a toned down web blossom could work, but also the Circle ability with the arms is pretty much just the taser web, so this ability could be the taser web. You quite literally do not need the mechanical arms to do this. The only ability I do not have a suitable replacement for is Triangle, as this ability needs something that moves Spider-Man forward in a way that is different and more bombastic than the web strike. Maybe something like the beatdown move in Web of Shadows? I don't know. Now let's get back to the abilities as they are in the game. The abilities all having their own cooldown makes it difficult to keep track of which abilities are available and which aren't. With 4 abilities, 4 gadgets, a focus bar, and an ultimate meter, all on different parts of the screen, it's a bit of a headache to look around and keep track of everything. I think the most obvious point of comparison would be the Norse God of War games, which had runic attacks on separate cooldowns as well. Those worked in those games since you only had to worry about 2 per weapon, and they were located next to everything else on the HUD, so your eyes weren't constantly darting around the screen. But another thing that made God of War's runic attacks more meaningful was that they were a bit harder to use. The Spider-Man's abilities in this game make you invincible once you activate them, except against bosses. So in most encounters you can freely spam them without a care in the world to abuse the invincibility you get from them. In God of War you get super armor while using runic attacks, so while the moves won't be interrupted, you'll still take damage. With a bit of thought you can still safely activate these abilities, but there is still that extra bit of thinking and strategy that goes into that, which is completely absent from the abilities in Spider-Man 2. It's strange because I feel as though there was already a better solution to how these abilities are handled. In Miles Morales, you could activate any of the abilities at any time at the cost of 1 focus bar. This kept combat fast and fun because I didn't have to constantly check to see which abilities I had available. I could just use the ones I wanted when I wanted to use them. This system has been done away with, and I suspect it's partially because of how the parry works. The parry is the single biggest addition to Spider-Man's base moveset in combat. Note that I said it's the biggest addition, not the best. By pressing L1, you can block incoming attacks with correct timing, allowing for a counter hit follow-up. The parry is another defensive tool that lets you stand your ground, open up enemies, and continue your assault. It's a decent idea, but I'm not entirely sure about its implementation. It isn't exactly clear which attacks you can and can't parry. Range attacks like gunshots aren't parryable, which makes sense, so it's just physical melee attacks then, okay. But then the Fire Cult's flamethrowers are parryable. Huh? And you can't parry in the air either. The late game symbiote enemies have an attack that targets you in the air, and you can't parry it. So I can parry fire, but not a physical tentacle thing? It makes it a little hard to rely on the parry because it's never clear what you can and can't block with it. The timing on the parry feels super inconsistent. Typically all you have to do is press the button right when Spider-Man's spider sense flashes red, but sometimes it feels as though you can activate it earlier with no penalty, especially those moves that can only be parried. Those feel like they have a much more generous parry window. That's another issue I have, the parry-only attacks, which are called heavy attacks. They aren't actually parry-only, you can still dodge them by jumping. It makes the distinction with these attacks feel completely arbitrary. Because it is. Usually in action games, attacks that can't be dodged because the attack's hitbox is too large and or lasts on this field for too long to be evaded by a dodge. But this game's parry-only attacks don't do this. They're normal attacks that if ported into the first game, you'd be able to dodge no problem. A similar type of issue is found with crush attacks that can't be parried and need to be dodged. Once again, there's no real distinction between these attacks and the parry attacks. They're only different because the game says so. This may be a personal thing, but I think the indicators used for these two different types of attacks are a little weird. The indicator for heavy attacks is pretty close to the usual spider sense indicator, so you'd think that would be the move you have to dodge. Then the crush moves have a very distinct indicator that pops out a lot more, which you'd think would be for the new parry mechanic, but it's actually this one that you have to dodge away from. Maybe it's just me, but I found that to be kind of strange. All that being said, it's not entirely bad, as these two types of attacks do keep you on your toes, as you have to pay attention and look for what type of attack an enemy is throwing out. I said earlier that I think the abilities were reworked to enable the parry. Now I'll explain what I meant by that. In Miles Morales, the abilities were tied to the focus bar, meaning that finishers had to be tied to something else, and the solution they came up with was pretty genius. Finishers in that game were banked every 15 hits, so it made you want to keep up your combo count to keep getting finishers. But the parry disrupts that. Failing the parry results in a normal block, where you take less damage and have your combo count reset as a result. Because of this, finishers can't be tied to the combo count, as it would be really frustrating for newer players coming to grips with the parry mechanic. They'd basically never be able to use finishers. And it would discourage the use of the parry, since failing it would mean not being able to use finishers, so people just wouldn't use it in order to keep their combo up. In general, the combo count has been downplayed in this game. It was explicitly stated in the first game that higher combo counts meant faster focus buildup, but that's not exactly the case here. I mean, it is, but only as an upgrade located at the very end of the skill tree, instead of simply being how the combat system works. So there isn't much of a reward to keeping your combo up, aside from, not getting hit. Focus has been slightly tweaked as well. You now need a full focus bar to heal. It's a simple change, but one that makes sense, and it makes the game a healthy bit more challenging. In general, it feels like focus builds a lot slower too in this game. Suit powers have been completely removed. Actually, that's not true. All the suit powers from the first game have been removed and replaced with 2 new ones, one for each Spider-Man, Symbiote Surge for Peter and Mega Venom Blast for Miles. While not technically suit powers, they're activated by pressing L3 and R3 at the same time, so they do fill the same role gameplay-wise. As far as these abilities go, I didn't use them that much. I'd like to say that it's because I welcomed the extra challenge and purposely tried not to use them, but that's not true. I didn't use these abilities because I forgot they were there. I can't say exactly why. I'm not sure if it's that I think these abilities are boring, or if the over-cluttered UI makes me barely notice the rinky-dink little bar for this ability. All I do know is that I didn't use them. Even after completing the story, when I continued playing the game at my own pace, I never used Symbiote Surge, and I only occasionally used Mega Venom Blast. I think this game really could have benefited from the ability to use different suit powers. Let's divorce them from the suits and just call them what they are: ultimate abilities. Honestly, many of the abilities from the first game weren't that good. Many were redundant and outclassed by the others, but that doesn't mean they should all have been thrown out, especially now that there are 2 different Spider-Men to play with. The 2 of them having a different selection of ultimates would have been a really cool way to give players more options while still differentiating the 2 Spider-Men. Put Miles' anime sword in there as a suit power, give him the electric punch one from the first game, give both Spideys the quip powers. I like the quips. The biggest disappointment for me gameplay-wise is definitely the omission of the suit mods. I really liked how the suit mods gave you a degree of customization without having an overly annoying gear system. There are these diverging skills in the skill tree that offer a bit of customization by giving you a choice between 2 different perks, but it's not the same thing. These divergent skills don't offer nearly enough variety, and some of them are completely useless in some situations. And they apply to both Spider-Men, so it doesn't serve as a way to differentiate the 2 through customization. Granted, a lot of the suit mods in the first game weren't very good. There were like 5 different ones dedicated to reducing different types of damage that really should have been rolled into one. One of them was literally just a way to spot hidden areas you needed to take pictures of to unlock the ESU suit, and there was that one that made you gain more XP from battles so you could just progress faster as long as you had it equipped. That was kind of strange, but I do think the idea of suit mods was really cool and could have been expanded upon here. Like the suit powers, I think it would have been cool if they had given each Spider-Man their own selection of different suit mods. Here's some quick examples. The first game had a mod where airborne attacks would build up a static charge that you could release by striking a grounded enemy. Give that to Miles, he's all about electricity. This game rightly makes the ability to slow down time before a fatal hit into one of the divergent perks, so yeah, keep that as a suit mod. The first game had a skill that allowed you to gain focus faster by timing your button presses with the hits of a combo. This ability has been completely cut here, so bringing it back as a suit mod would be cool. And I'm sure you could come up with a billion more. These are just some examples. Divvy them up between the 2 Spider-Men and you could have a really cool customization system. Of course, all of these changes to Spider-Man's controls wouldn't matter if the enemies were awful, but I'm glad to say that the enemies in this game are pretty good. Many of the enemy types from the first game return here, with the same mechanics you would expect out of them, but there are a ton of new enemy types that help spruce things up. The symbiote enemy faction behaves in a completely different way compared to any of the enemies seen in prior games. The green variant specifically is a very odd type of enemy that goes down in a single web shot, but is immune to practically anything else. So while they might seem ridiculously easy, you'll still need to pay attention to them since they're very slippery enemies that can take a bite out of you when you least expect it. There's a higher tier of big enemy that trumps the brutes from the first game, and while these guys seem daunting at first due to their high health and damage, they're actually not too bad. It's largely due to how open they are to your approach. When I fought one for the first time, I incorrectly thought you could only damage them after a parry, but that's not true. You can still use your abilities and gadgets against them, so they're not overly restricting. The hunters have mechanical dogs and birds that provide a new type of challenge. The dogs can jam your abilities and they start to self-destruct when they're at low health, but you actually have a bit of time to throw them before they blow, which is pretty cool. There is one issue I have with the hunter faction. They have the ability to cast this electric field in the air that discourages air combat. This is a cool idea, but in practice it's super frustrating. I have platinumed the game and I still do not know which enemy is responsible for this electric field. I don't think the game ever tells you. Maybe they did in a super small text box, but I didn't see it. And in gameplay it's not clear at all which enemy does this, so I don't know which enemy I have to prioritize to stop it from coming out. It also comes out way too quickly, so I have no time to react to it and get back to the ground before I take damage. It just shoots out, and if you're in the air, you're going to get hit. You can even get stuck above the electric field and take damage from it multiple times on your way down. This is the only aspect of this game's enemy design that I think needs to be reworked. Some kind of area indicator in the air to let you know it's coming would be enough for me. Another complaint I have is related to what's not in the game. The whip and swordsman enemies from the first game were really annoying and restrictive, which is probably why they didn't show up much there. But with the addition of the parry and the abilities, I think those enemies would fit right into this game and would actually be a lot more fun to fight against. I can't end this section on combat without talking about the boss battles. Boss battles are the most improved area of this game's combat. It's a bit difficult to explain, but they are actual boss battles now. In the first game, bosses were these little set pieces that you could get through with one hand tied behind your back. But now, bosses have actual attack patterns, a variety of moves that require you to pay attention and vary your approach. More of your attacks actually feel like they work against these enemies, unlike the first game where bosses usually required you to do one specific thing with no deviation. They have health bars too, which is something I asked for, and for some reason I got a lot of flack for that suggestion. Everyone who said health bars were unnecessary or immersion breaking, go eat web. Despite these massive improvements, I do have a few issues with the boss fights. The main issue is that they still feel too constrained by the arenas they take place in. The Scream boss fight is the most clear example of this. The other boss fights take place in enclosed spaces, but Scream's takes place in a seemingly open area. There are invisible walls everywhere that force you back into the intended boss arena, and it's not even that hard to hit them either since Scream moves around all over the place. It's just so disappointing to see this when I feel like the bosses in this game could have benefited from larger, sprawling arenas. That one advertisement of Peter and Miles fighting Venom through the city should have been what the game provided. Instead, the boss fights feel very enclosed and very video gamey. The other issue I have with the bosses is that I want more of them. It's disappointing that there's only 7 real boss fights in this game. I don't count Sandman since he's way more of a set piece than a proper boss fight, and I'm not counting Mysterio either since that fight was all smoke and no fire. So putting this all together, combat is good in this game. It has plenty of problems, don't get me wrong. Customization has decreased dramatically with the gutting of suit mods and suit powers. I find the abilities to be more obnoxious than they should have been. The parry is iffy, and the freaking upshot, man. Ugh. But there's plenty of cool stuff too. General combat has been improved, boss battles have been greatly improved, and as much as I rag on the abilities and gadgets, they are still fun to use. Stealth is an aspect in these games I've never really cared for. Generally, I don't like stealth in video games, so I'll admit that I am pretty biased against the concept as a whole. I don't know, my action game brain doesn't really have the patience for it, and I usually find stealth systems to be more frustrating than fun. This is why I didn't mention stealth at all in my video talking about what Spider-Man 2 could improve on. I didn't really care what they did in the sequel since I was largely satisfied with how it functioned in Spider-Man 2018. That's why I'm legitimately shocked to see how much stealth has regressed in this game. Stealth was already pretty bare bones in the first game. Your main options were the stealth takedown on square and the web strike takedown on triangle. You could shoot webs at things to distract people, and you could use environmentals to take people out too. All of this returns in the sequel, with the added ability to perform takedowns from walls and ceilings, something that returns from Miles Morales. But 2 key factors are missing, the impact web and trip mine gadgets. These 2 gadgets relied on minor levels of positioning and limited ammunition to offer a quick way to take down enemies. They weren't much, sure, but they were additional options options for you to play with, options that don't exist anymore in Spider-Man 2. Miles' remote mines from his game are gone as well, though I won't shed any tears there since they were insultingly brain dead. Something that I will cry about is the removal of the ability to yank down webbed up enemies. That was a fun concept for Miles' game, and I think it would pair well with the one new ability we get here. The web tether is the only real addition to stealth, a gadget with an infinite supply that allows you to create perch points nearly anywhere you want. As cool as this ability is, I don't like its implementation too much. The first issue I have with it is that it really isn't a new ability. By that I mean it's not a different option to the takedowns, it's just something that helps facilitate them. It's an extension of the takedowns, not an inherently different ability. The other issue I have with it is that it's extremely brain dead. Like I said before, this gadget has an infinite supply, so you can shoot out as many as you want without fear of using it up by getting a bad angle. The concussion burst can be upgraded to be used in stealth, where it'll create a sound to lure away enemies. I still feel like this isn't a new ability since it's just a stronger version of shooting webs at the distraction objects, and once again, it doesn't let you take down enemies in a new way, it just makes it easier to do the stealth takedowns you've already been doing. There's also a double takedown skill you can get, but come on. This is not a different ability, it's once again an extension of what the Spider-Men already have, and it's super brain dead too. It makes stealth even easier than it already was. With this, you can think even less about positioning and just press square to win. So even though I can acknowledge that this is worse, I can't bring myself to really care. Like I said, I'm not a stealth guy. So for me, this is less of a legitimate issue with the game and more of an odd curiosity. I'll go into the suits for both characters in more detail in later videos, so I'll keep it short here. Nearly 30 of Peter's suits from the first game have been removed, and to be perfectly honest, most of the drop suits are ones that I didn't like very much. But almost all of my favorite suits from the first game were dropped as well. In their place are a mixed bag of new suits. For the most part, Peter's selection of suits is very tame. A lot of expected and safe choices. The only weird ones that I didn't expect were the Secret War Civil War suit and the Scarlet Spider 3, since I don't think anybody really likes those. But generally I feel like there are far fewer obscure and unorthodox comic picks. I know a lot of people didn't like the Spirit Spider suit in Spider-Man 2018, but that suit was far more creative and distinct than any of Peter's suits this time around. A big reason for this is that a large chunk of Peter's outfits in this game are from the movies. Excluding the digital deluxe edition suits, Peter has 34 outfits. 13 of those are movie suits. That's more than a third. There's nothing inherently wrong with having suits from the movies, but many of them are very similar takes on Spider-Man's typical costumes, so there isn't that much variety. But it's not all the fault of these movie suits. Of the 21 remaining suits, 4 of them are story related, 5 of them are Insomniac original designs, so there are only 12 alternate suits based off of things from the comic books, a step down from the 17 Peter had in the first game. The deluxe edition suits are another thing this game has, and man, I think it's cool that they got several different artists from outside their company to design these suits, basically having guest artists, which is a nice idea. But I only really like one of these, 2 tops. If not for the fact that I have a YouTube channel and was planning to make a video on this game, I would not have bought the deluxe edition because even at essentially $1 per costume, I still think these aren't really worth it. A lot of suits do return from the first game. Some look better, some look about the same, and some are worse. The advanced suit was orange before, but at least it was pretty vibrant. Here the orange has been toned down and it looks so drab now. I don't know what they did to the 2099 and Scarlet Spider suits, but the additional detailing on them has been made far more apparent. I used to be okay with these outfits because the extra details used to be subtle, but now they're way too noticeable and I find them distracting. Some suits have messed up eyes, the Raimi suit's web pattern is even worse, the Stark suit had its web pattern removed. What happened, guys? The last point of annoyance I have with Peter's costumes are how his abilities make half of them look goofy. Nothing sours my mood faster than using a red and blue classic suit just to see 4 ill-fitting mechanical arms shoot out of it, or goo tentacles. I said this earlier, but you can't opt out of these, they're always going to be there. It gets worse once you unlock the anti-Venom suit since the goo permanently stays with you in your parry animation. Even if you're using a non-symbiote suit and have all the Iron Spider powers equipped, your parry animation will still feature the anti-Venom tentacles. Miles has a similar similar yet much smaller issue with his web wings. They're almost always red, which doesn't match some of his suits. This section has been super negative so far, so I'm obligated to say that there is a lot to like in regards to the suits. The Superior Spider-Man suit was one of the suits I've been looking forward to, and it looks great. The classic black suit is here, thank God, and the Amazing Spider-Man 2 suit is easily the best red and blue outfit these games have had. Heck, even Peter's new default suit has a pretty good design. The returning classic Iron Spider suit looks even cooler now since it's a lot more reflective. That's the power of the PS5, people. Miles has a ton of good suits too. He's got 2 suits based off of other heroes that look great, and like Peter, his new default is pretty good. I have to highlight his Tokusatsu suit as it's the only deluxe edition suit that I think is really good. His on-coded? Sometimes it's pronounced like that. His on-coded suit is alright too. To stay on this positive train, this game's suit style system is also pretty cool. Some suits have 3 alternate suit styles so that there are 4 versions total. This is only on some of the suits though. The movie suits and deluxe edition suits don't have alternate styles. Neither do the story-related symbiote suits for some reason. So almost half of Peter's suits don't have alternate styles, which is lame. Like with most alternate color schemes in superhero games, there's usually only 1 or 2 alt colors that are worthwhile, with most of the others looking like bootleg action figures. Sorry, trying to stay positive here. But it's still cool there is so much variety, and some of the alternate styles are far better than the original. And I have to point out that these suits all come included with the game, except for the deluxe edition suits, but they aren't that expensive. Each of these suits could easily have been sold for $5, but Insomniac didn't do that. There's no nickel and diming going on, with 18 outfits costing $100 or something. This practice is something that's becoming incredibly rare in games now, so even with the issues I have with a lot of the suits, I do have to commend Insomniac for this. So overall, I give the suits a pretty good out of 10. Now we can get to the story. To be honest, I've been putting off this part of the video because I really did not like this game's story. To give it a mathematical value, I liked maybe 10% of this. I know that sounds harsh, but that's because it is. I need you to understand that I did not come into this game wanting to dislike it. You can watch my live stream if you don't believe me. Listen to how excited I was when I first started playing. Believe me, I wanted to like this game, and that's why I was so disappointed. Hopefully by the end of this, you can understand my perspective. This game's story is split into 2 unequal portions. Just like the first game, it's separated by its 2 main antagonists. In the first, it was Mr. Negative and Dr. Octopus, and here it's Kraven and Venom. The Kraven section is the longer one, as well as the least interesting. The Venom plotline contains both the symbiote, one of the most iconic Spider-Man concepts, and the relationship with Harry, Peter's best friend. Kraven has nothing, really. Kraven's motivation is that he's dying of a terminal illness and wants to die in a great hunt instead of a hospital bed, so he brings an army to New York in order to hopefully get his wish. And look, I've never hunted IRL, but from my understanding, you are never on equal footing with whatever it is that you're hunting. So if you are ever at risk of dying while hunting something, I think that just makes you a bad hunter. So from my perspective, Kraven's goal to die in combat is contradictory to his supposed profession of a hunter. The story is aware of this though. I don't think he's ever actually called Kraven the Hunter. Maybe once, but mostly he's just called Kraven. If I'm being honest, this is the main reason Kraven didn't work for me as an antagonist. He's no longer Kraven the Hunter, he's more like Kraven the Gladiator here. There's far more emphasis on him being a powerful physical threat, rather than him being a meticulous strategist skilled with weaponry and traps. He hardly ever uses tactics and strategy. For the most part, Kraven's really just a big meathead who relies on his physical power more than anything else. Outside of his encounters with Symbiote Peter, Kraven never uses his opponent's weaknesses against them. His grand finale is his battle with Venom, where he doesn't use the symbiote's weakness against it, even though he knows what it is and has used it before. It's just a big head-to-head fight. I can't help but feel that it's all sort of dumb. And this would have been fine if he had a much smaller role in the story, but so much of it is dedicated to him, and there's not enough meat on the Kraven bones to keep this part of the story engaging. This game is heavily concerned with making Kraven a dangerous threat, and the way they try to do this is by having Kraven kill several supervillains. Shocker, Vulture, and Electro are all killed off-screen. Scorpion is the only villain we actually see Kraven kill. And this attempt at building up Kraven doesn't work for 3 reasons. The first is that most of these happen off-screen, so it feels lazy and cheap. The second is that these murdered villains really weren't that tough. Shocker was just a bank robber, and while he was capable of a lot of property damage, he wasn't a violent killer. Vulture was a dying old man in a wingsuit. Killing him does not make a person look cool. And Scorpion was a total cakewalk in the first game, his boss battle being so easy that it basically played itself. Electro is the only villain here that actually makes for an impressive kill, but according to Kraven himself, Electro is actually really easy to kill, so oh well. The third reason this doesn't work is that we don't have an emotional connection to any of these characters. None of these characters had interesting personalities, and neither the Spider-Man nor the player had any actual relationship with them. So killing them elicits less of a, "No way, I can't believe they died," and more of an, "Oh, okay." There are two ways that they could have improved this. For starters, Kraven needed to kill villains that were actually threatening. Rhino would have made the most sense since he was the strongest enemy from the first game in terms of brute strength. Kraven would have actually looked cool taking down Rhino all by himself. It seems as though some of the people working on the game agreed, as an unused out of bounds area has Rhino's head mounted on a wall alongside Vulture, Scorpion, and Shocker. For whatever reason though, they changed their mind on this. Tombstone was also a super dangerous and murder-hungry villain in the first game, his impervious skin actually being something that could pose a problem for Kraven. But not only is he spared Kraven's wrath, he's also completely reformed, something that really doesn't match up with his personality in the first game. Seriously, in the first game, Tombstone was closer to a horror movie monster than a supervillain, but apparently he's totally chill now? Okay. The second way they could have made this better is by creating an emotional connection to a villain before killing them. Let me give you a hypothetical example of how this could have been achieved. Imagine if Peter became aware of Kraven's true intentions of hunting villains for sport earlier, and so he tries to save Shocker. Peter manages to get to Shocker, and the two of them talk. Shocker's freaked out of his mind, telling Spider-Man that this is the second time he's been forced back into the suit against his will. First for the events of the 2018 game, and now once again. He doesn't want to do this anymore, he just wants to go live a normal life and leave this all behind him. Spider-Man talks to him, tells him to calm down, to take off his helmet, and breathe. Here we get to see the human side of the character, not the iconic and marketable supervillain, but the human being, Herman Schultz. What would follow is a segment where Spider-Man and Shocker try to make their way out of whatever facility they're in this hypothetical scenario. The two of them working together and talking as they do so. Maybe Peter even offers Shocker a job at the Emily May Foundation if he really is serious about turning his life around. But just before they can get out, Shocker is separated from Spider-Man and comes face to face with Kraven. Unable to do anything, Spider-Man is forced to watch as Kraven dismantles Shocker and eventually kills him. Not to toot my own horn or anything since it's my idea, but I think that scenario would have been a way more effective way to build up Kraven, allowing us to get attached to a character we didn't think much of before, only to have them coldly ripped away would have been really heartbreaking. It would have made Kraven a much more personal threat, giving us the players a genuine reason to hate him and want him to go down, but we get nothing like that. I know a lot of this may sound like sacrilege to some, as Kraven seems to have been a hit with nearly everyone else. I'll admit that there are things to like about him. He's got a cool design, his voice actor does a phenomenal job bringing the character to life. His boss fight was cool, as was his theme song. Let's see, positive things. No, that's it. Kraven's role in the story is to fill time until Harry can become Venom. Once that happens, he completely disappears from the narrative. This isn't the first time Insomniac has done this, as Mr. Negative filled the same role in the first game, filling for time until the real main antagonist could take center stage. Where the two differ is that Mr. Negative felt like way more of a threat, and he was genuinely more intense and evil in his actions. He commits an act of flat-out terrorism and uses his powers to make an innocent man take his own life. Kraven doesn't do anything nearly as intense as that. Honestly, when comparing the two, Kraven ends up looking downright goofy. Another difference between them is that Negative shared the spotlight with a far more compelling villain. Now let's talk about the Venom plotline. The Venom/symbiote storyline is the actual main story of the game. It's literally what the game opens on. The very first scene we see is Harry Osborn in a flashback/dream sequence where he gets the symbiote. I saw a lot of people say they didn't realize this was a dream and they thought that this sequence was completely literal. Bro, Harry literally wakes up from it. What do you mean you didn't know it was a dream? As the main person attached to the symbiote, it's no surprise that Harry Osborn is at the center of the story. So let's talk about him. Insomniac's Harry Osborn is not a very good character. He's likable enough, but he's not interesting or memorable, and he has the depth of a single drop of water. Like with most of the other characters on the good guy side of things, Insomniac mistakenly believed that making a character nice is a sufficient substitute for giving them a personality. I mean, really, let's look at Harry. He's a nice dude who's a bit nerdy, and that's all I got. That's all there is to him. He doesn't want to die, I guess, but I mean, don't we all? He's rich, but this seems to have no real effect on his upbringing, how he carries himself, or how he interacts with others. So yeah, he's a nice dude who's also a nerd. And this might have been fine if not for the fact that we already have 3 other characters that fit this exact same description. Now, I do have to state that what makes a character good or likable will be different from person to person. For some, it is legitimately enough for a character to be nice in order to like them, but I believe that generally this isn't true. Niceness and good moral character is not synonymous with something being well written and engaging, just as rudeness and evil morals do not inherently make something poorly written and boring. In fact, it's usually the opposite. Harry simply needed more layers to him outside of being nice because he flat out does not have a personality outside of that. This silly little pose Harry makes in the Steel Foundry is the most personality he's given throughout the entire game, and it's a reused animation from Miles. It's difficult to care about Harry because he's introduced in this game. While he did appear as a voice in Spider-Man 2018, this does nothing for us for 2 reasons. For one, nearly all of his lines in that game are the same thing. Peter, this research station was set up to fix environmental issue, but Oscorp's new evil product is getting in the way because of some kind of problem. My mom, blah blah blah, please fix it. These Oscorp station dialogues don't tell us anything that isn't told to us again in the sequel, that being that Harry loves his mom, is a nice guy, and is a bit of a nerd. The second reason these don't work is that Harry had a completely different face and voice in the last game. I know that many people brush off recasts like they're nothing, but there is a certain level of attachment that grows with a person's face and voice. Just look at how many people still aren't over the change to Peter's face. And if it was just Harry's face that was different, that'd be one thing, but with a different voice as well, this is essentially a completely different person, or at least that's what it feels like. The game is fully aware of the fact that it needs to get people attached to Harry as quickly as possible, which is why upon his arrival, it immediately throws the player into a flashback section that screams, "Please like this character." It's certainly better than what they did with Finn in Miles Morales, where the flashback designed to get the player invested in her happened right before the final boss, but it's still not very good. Aside from feeling incredibly forced, you don't even get to know much about Harry here. The flashback starts as a fun, innocent escapade, with Harry and Peter trying to get a flash drive to salvage a school project. But then the scene completely derails at the end when Norman appears to tell Harry that his mother has passed. It's a very bizarre sequence because it creates tonal whiplash as you instantly transition between fun hijinks to the death of a loved one. Even without that, the emotional weight of the scene ends up being light as a feather. The reason this scene doesn't work is that it quite literally happens at a distance. We, the players, attach ourselves to Peter. It's through his eyes that we're seeing these things, and he's not really a part of the scene. He's just awkwardly watching it happen from the side. This should be a big moment for both Harry and Peter, but instead it feels as though only Harry is affected. Then there's the flash drive plot, which feels completely inconsequential because it is. That isn't the point of the sequence. This is the point of the sequence. So everything with the flash drive becomes a total waste of time. A waste of time in a game where the story is already stretched thin as it struggles to cram all of its ideas together. What bothers me most about this flashback is how there were better options for it. Better options for different flashbacks that could show the bond between Harry and Peter. We hear about how Flash Thompson would beat the pants off these two, but I would like to have seen that. We hear about how Harry would stay over at Peter's to avoid seeing his sick mother, but I would like to have seen that. Either of those moments would have been more dramatic and personal situations that would really be able to show why these two are friends and why they mean so much to each other. Instead, we see them dick around for a bit, then Norman shows up and trauma dumps on Harry, and the scene's over. What might be my biggest problem with Harry is his relationship with his father. To be more specific, what relationship? I'm not kidding, what do these two think of each other? Norman barely appears in this game, which by itself is a crime since he's the reason any of this even happens, but whenever he is on screen, it's just to show up, say 2 words to Harry, and then leave. Are these two on good terms? Bad terms? Was their relationship different before Harry and his mom got sick? There's one scene that shows up out of nowhere to set up that Harry is jealous of Peter because his father likes Peter more? This scene doesn't even make any sense because if Harry and Norman barely interact in this game, Peter Peter and Norman interact even less. Norman, you've talked to Peter like maybe 3 times across 2 games. It feels like these two don't even know each other. And then this jealousy thing only comes up again twice. In gameplay dialogue you might not even notice if you're focusing on the gameplay too much. And just why? Why is this here? But Harry's relationship with his father isn't as important as his relationship with Peter. I mean, it should be, but let's stay on track. Peter and Harry's friendship doesn't feel real. Part of this is that the emotional connection between them feels weak, but another aspect is the logistics of their friendship. Here's what I mean by that. Why did Peter and Harry even go to the same school? We've seen where Harry lives and we know where Peter lives, and Harry's really rich, so why does he go to a public school so far away from his home? Now you might retort that it's the same as the Sam Raimi movies, where Harry was academically anemic and flunked out of a ton of private schools. If that is the case here, the game doesn't say so. There's like one line where Harry says he couldn't have passed the class without Peter's help, but outside of that, Harry actually seems quite competent in math and science, so I don't know if that's the explanation for it. Then we have the issue that Peter, despite being super close to Harry, didn't tell him he was Spider-Man. Peter at times seems to care more about Harry than his own girlfriend, and yet Peter didn't tell him that he was Spider-Man. Nor did Harry find out on his own despite being Peter's best friend for years. And through all that time, Peter being Spider-Man never put a strain on their friendship at all? It's these sort of things that just don't make sense. But then we have the emotional aspect of their relationship, which I don't feel is handled well either. Peter and Harry don't treat each other like close friends. They don't seem to have that familiarity and comfort with each other that lets them playfully rib each other or to casually converse about the darker parts of their lives and what they're really going through. They don't seem to have common interests either. No movies, shows, or games that the two can bond over. You know, the things friends talk about. Instead, they feel like people who are only vaguely acquainted. Their conversations sound like they're going out of their way to be nice to each other because they're still not sure of each other's boundaries. It's odd because this game already features an example of a believable pair of best friends. As boring as the two are, Miles and Genki actually do feel like best friends. They treat each other with that same familiarity I was talking about earlier, so I can believe that these two have been friends forever. Though I guess it does help that we saw more of these two together in Miles Morales, a luxury Harry doesn't have. A big part of Harry's character is the creation of the Emily May Foundation, a tech startup focused on making the world a better place. It's essentially Octavius's lab and the feast shelter from the first game smushed together, except it's less memorable than either of those places because you spend far less time there. You go in once as Peter to watch Harry give the most boring guided tour ever, then you go in one other time to create the lizard antidote, and then the place gets blown up. Comparing Emily May to Octavius's lab, the two couldn't be more different. We've already established that the extra time at 00's lab made it feel like a more significant place, but there are 2 other factors that I think illustrate this. First is the context in which these 2 settings are presented. Otto's lab is a small laboratory that feels incorrect to be labeled as Octavius Industries given its size. We even see the whole operation get shut down, barely saved when Octavius pulls every favor he has to keep the place afloat, even taking help from AIM, the famous Marvel Comics supervillain group. The place has a real underdog feeling to it, so you really want to see it succeed. That's why it's so heartbreaking when it doesn't. Now let's look at Emily May, a place of seemingly unlimited resources that is practically a technological utopia. There seems to be nothing wrong here. The place is played completely straight. No one ever brings up how the Foundation's goals are unrealistically idealistic, how it'll be hard to justify keeping the place up and running since it isn't profitable to help people, which was kind of the point of not just Octavius's lab, but also the Oscorp research stations in the first game. You know, the things run by Harry? It feels like there should be a catch, but there isn't, so the whole place doesn't feel real. Secondly, there's the science minigames. In the first game, you did these at the lab for 2 reasons. The first was completing the Spider-Man simulator by doing science stuff as Peter. The second and far more important reason was to help develop the arms. Every science minigame you do at Octavius's lab was done to further develop the technology that would then be used by Dr. Octopus. And it created a link between Peter and the player, since it wasn't just Peter that helped create the arms, it was you. You did it. You helped create Dr. Octopus. And that was really cool. But here in Spider-Man 2, you do some science minigames at Emily May just to establish that they exist so that you can do them again in other parts of the game. That's it. So the personal connection to the place and the guy who runs it doesn't exist. When comparing Harry and Otto directly, the difference between them is night and day. When it comes to their diseases, I would argue that it's much easier to feel for Otto. Otto's condition is never named, but it is similar to ALS, also known as Lou Gehrig's disease. degeneration of nerve cells leading to less control over a person's motor functions. This means that Otto's disease has a real-life basis and a clear set of symptoms. We see exactly how Otto is worsening and can see how his condition will worsen in the future, slowly becoming trapped within his own body until he dies. Harry, on the other hand, also has an unnamed disease and it's just vaguely killing him. There's no real-world counterpart and there's no clear symptoms outside of looking sickly. The Amazing Spider-Man movies at least had the decency to give the Osborn disease clear physical symptoms with the skin disfigurement, but here he's just dying. Because of this lack of tangible symptoms or a clear basis in reality, Harry's disease feels made up, and that makes it a lot harder to care about him. To compare the two as people, Otto had a personality. He was a nice and smart guy, but also a coward. One who hid his less desirable feelings and intentions because it was easier than confronting someone directly. The negative side of him then came out once the mechanical arms freed him from his inhibitions, allowing him to do what he had always wanted. This would be the part where I then compare him to Harry, but I can't. I literally can't say anything about this guy. Harry honestly doesn't feel like a character. He's more like a plot device that Norman and Peter can feel sad about. And maybe this would be okay if either of those characters were handled well, but I can't say that they were. Norman's issue is that he barely shows up, so I really don't have anything to say about him. Peter, on the other hand, let's talk about Peter. Insomniac's rendition of Peter has never been that great of a character. I know this will sound insane to some people, since this version is many people's favorite, and some will accuse me of switching up, but let me explain. When the 2018 game released, a big part of what made this version of Peter appealing was how he differed from other modern adaptations of Spider-Man. He was not a fourth wall breaking shield agent like in the Ultimate Spider-Man cartoon. He was not a glorified sidekick like in the MCU. He was not an annoying know-it-all who went to a private school like the 2017 cartoon. And most importantly, unlike all those versions I just mentioned, he was not a teenager in high school. As important and appealing as these differences are, they are still only surface level differences. When you look closer, you can see that Insomniac's Peter is much more in line with these renditions than he is the older and more traditional takes on the character. Like most modern interpretations, this Peter lacks the biting wit, charisma, and most importantly, the foul temper of his original comic counterpart. As a result, just like the other adaptations I listed, this Peter ends up feeling very bland, toothless, and safe. Despite this, there was still one other reason that I know people really like this version for, myself included. The single defining moment that solidified this Peter as one of the greats in people's hearts was the 2018 game's ending. Specifically the choice with Aunt May. Peter is given the choice between saving his aunt or doing the right thing, a choice the character was once given in the comics as well. In the comics, Peter makes the wrong choice, choosing to sacrifice his future in order to keep May around. It's a moment that is almost universally agreed to be one of the worst Spider-Man stories ever, with the only real support for the decision coming from Marvel themselves. That's why it was so significant when Insomniac Peter made the opposite choice. You have to understand that it's not just about the physical logistics of the situation, but thematically it shows that this Peter is capable of letting go of the safety and comfort of the past in order to move forward into an uncertain future. Something people have been begging for in the comics for years now, yet have been unable to receive. So despite this version of the character having some issues, I still think the stage was set for more exciting and new things going forward. But as the game progressed, I felt as this potential slowly slipped away. I mentioned earlier that this version of Peter lacks the bad temper of his comic counterpart. This omission makes the character less interesting, but it also directly affects the plot of the story once the symbiote enters the picture. In the original comic books, the symbiote did not affect Peter's mood. That's something that only happens in adaptations. Adaptations that go with the mood-altering version of the symbiote succeed when they use Peter's existing character flaws to show how the symbiote makes them worse. Even Spider-Man 3. That's right, cringy dance Spider-Man 3 does a good job of showing that Peter is being selfish, arrogant, and dismissive even before the symbiote touches him. So when he's wearing the suit, these negative aspects are brought to the forefront and he's forced to confront his own actions. That is not what happens with the symbiote in this story. Peter gets the symbiote in this game after he's mortally wounded by Kraven, and the symbiote passes from Harry to Peter. The symbiote almost immediately starts to affect Peter's mind, which is odd considering it didn't do that at all when it was on Harry. It's also odd because Insomniac's Peter is quite possibly the nicest version of the character ever created, so there are no negative traits to exaggerate. Instead, the symbiote has to essentially brainwash him into a different person altogether to create conflict. This leads to the conflict with the symbiote feeling incredibly forced and artificial, especially because it all happens so fast. Peter goes from his normal state to completely deranged way too quickly. Worse still is how Peter has absolutely no amount of self-reflection. Every adaptation of the symbiote story that has the symbiote alter Peter's mind ends with Peter realizing that the symbiote is doing something to him. Because Peter's supposed to be a smart guy, so he should realize when something's wrong with him. And he's built his entire sense of morality around being responsible, so he should notice when he's not being responsible. Yet this never happens here. There's one moment during Kraven's party where Peter uncharacteristically throws a guy out of a window. Peter then says, "That wasn't me," and that's all the self-reflection he does. He continues to use the symbiote suit afterwards with no reservations. So combine the symbiote making Peter cartoonishly evil with his inability to realize that something is clearly wrong with him, and what you end up with is a character that looks like a total moron. And I know that the immediate defense of this is that it isn't a showcase of Peter's ineptitude, but instead a showcase of the symbiote's ability to manipulate people. I don't really buy that excuse, but let's look at how the story tries to justify this. There's a bit in the story where we get to go into Peter's mind as the symbiote takes hold. This is where we see that Peter, allegedly, feels a sense of frustration at how villains and criminals he puts away often end up breaking out and getting free. This feeling is alleviated by the symbiote proposing that they just kill these people. You might have noticed I said Peter allegedly feels this way. That's because Peter himself shows no indication that he feels this way. There's even a whole side quest dedicated to Peter staunchly defending the point of not killing criminals. The second reason as to how the symbiote was able to get such a strong hold of Peter's mind is Aunt May. Peter is still mourning the loss of his aunt, and the symbiote somehow vaguely uses this to get Peter to do things. Once Harry becomes Venom, we'll get to that, don't worry, the symbiote uses the voice of Harry's mother to trick him into going along with the symbiote's goal. This is a really interesting concept that is not utilized nearly enough. This should have been happening to Peter, the symbiote using Aunt May's voice to string him along, maybe even convince him to kill criminals and supervillains, putting the idea in his head that if he had done this from the start, then maybe she would still be alive. That would have been a really interesting twist on the symbiote story, one that would make use of this game's continuity and characters to better serve the narrative. But we don't get that. Instead, the symbiote makes Peter big mad and then Miles beats it off of him. That's really it. Oh right, Miles is in this game. Miles is another example of Insomniac's nice, well-meaning characters with no real substance to them. This isn't new to this game, he's been like this since his debut in Spider-Man 2018. It was fine there since he was a supporting character with a small role, and it was overlooked in his solo game since people didn't expect much out of it, but it really stands out here since he shares the role of co-lead with Peter. At least, he's supposed to. Miles is barely in this game. He's almost completely divorced from the symbiote plotline until the very end. He's not there when Harry debuts his new powers. He's not there to witness Harry's stint as Agent Venom. He's not there when Peter almost dies, and he's not there when Venom is born. This might have been fine if Miles spent his time doing interesting stuff, but he doesn't. I wrote a story summary to help me get my thoughts in order, and sandwiched in between two paragraphs of Peter and Mary Jane doing stuff is the single line, "Miles helps out a lady at a museum." Like, bro, come on. Miles spends most of his time not writing a 500-word essay. Occasionally, he'll do some smaller activity like the Mysterio bit at Coney Island or the museum thing I mentioned earlier. He's the one who gets to interact with Black Cat for the Portal tech demo mission. This one really highlights how uninteresting and underexplored Miles is as a character. Peter says that Miles should take care of Cat because Miles is a new face, so she'll listen to him more. What? Wouldn't she respond better to the guy she's known for years? But after playing the mission, I have to ask, how would this have gone down differently if Peter went instead? It wouldn't. It would be the same. Both Peter and Miles are super nice and would be willing to help her out. We know this because we saw this happen in the last game. Even when she was lying to him, Peter still helped her, and he's obviously willing to do the same here. So why did Miles have to go? Well, because the developers realized they needed to give Miles something to do. Outside of that, Miles is busy seething over Mr. Negative, the man who killed his father. This is a legitimately interesting plotline, and in my opinion, the highlight of the game's story. Miles is in a similar position to what Lee found himself in years ago. Both were given extraordinary powers, and both of them had the chance to use those powers to take revenge on the man responsible for the loss in their lives. Lee succumbed to his anger, to his vengeance, yet Miles chooses to move on, in doing so showing Lee a new path away from the anger, hate, and death that's followed him until now. It's good stuff. But then we get back to the symbiote storyline and it sucks. Like I said earlier, Miles is barely involved in this. He basically just swoops in at the end to fight Peter and save the day. This is actually the whole reason that Peter's ability to reflect on his actions has been removed. Because if Peter was capable of single-handedly repelling the symbiote, Miles would have nothing to do in this story. I think a much more obvious and easy solution to this problem would be to give Miles the symbiote instead. It directly ties him to the symbiote plotline. His anger towards Lee could be amplified by the symbiote, which would be an interesting conflict to see him try to overcome. And most importantly, it would get Miles to actually interact with Harry. We'll get into it a bit more when we get to the game's ending, but a major problem with the game's story is that Miles and Harry don't really get to know each other. A significant part of the finale hinges on the conflict between these two, and it is really hard to take this seriously because there is no real relationship between them. I'll take a second to say something positive about Miles here. Miles' tech savviness has completely evaporated in this game, Insomniac seemingly realizing that it was a bad idea for him to have interests so similar to Peter, especially when it's not at all necessary for Miles to be so interested and adept in technology, when mechanically he already has his ridiculous Venom powers, and narratively Genki is there to be the tech guy. Instead, Miles' focus is placed into his music. It's what he's going to school for, and he uses this stuff to combat Venom. It's not a lot, since it's fixing an issue that shouldn't have existed to begin with, but it is an improvement. The last thing I want to touch on regarding Miles is his relationship with Peter. The single biggest failing in this game's relationships is the one between Peter and Miles. I'm not even sure what their relationship is. It's not that of a teacher and student, since we've never really seen Peter teach Miles anything. In the first game, Peter taught him how to swing off screen. In Miles Morales, Peter left a series of holographic tests for Miles, but he didn't teach him anything in person. So that felt very impersonal, and it never made me believe in their relationship. This game asserts that Miles' solo game was all the experience he needed to be on the same level as Peter, so Peter never teaches him anything here because Miles apparently doesn't need it. It's actually Peter who seems to need teaching, since he's the one constantly getting tossed around with Miles coming in to save him. The clear example of this relationship being done correctly are the Spider-Verse movies. Peter and Miles in those movies actually feel like friends, and due to their more significant age gap, Peter fits into the mentor role much better. I think it's that age gap that makes Peter and Miles' relationship so awkward here. They're far enough that they're not equivalent contemporaries, but they're still too close in age for Peter to be the old guy because they're both still young. And they don't feel like friends either. They treat each other more like coworkers, people who only hang out with each other because they have to. However, the narrative plays out as if these two are already super close, and that we, the audience, already believe that they're super close, so it makes no actual effort to show that they are super close. And I say that because the narrative does believe that these two are close to each other. That's how their relationship is presented. The Peter boss fight hinges on you believing in their relationship, but it ends up feeling emotionally hollow because it's a relationship that barely exists. It also fails because there's no actual tension or conflict between the two. Peter is not actually jealous of Miles and his extra abilities. He doesn't actually think that Miles is getting in the way of him doing his thing. He doesn't actually have an insecurity problem from getting saved by Miles all the time. It's just the symbiote. But if Peter was allowed to have some kind of negative aspects to his character, if he was allowed to not agree with Miles on everything, maybe this fight could have been interesting. Another thing that I think is a huge missed opportunity to build a relationship between these two is with the Mr. Negative subplot. Peter should be able to relate to Miles in this situation. He went through something incredibly similar with Uncle Ben's death. Peter could tell him about the guy who killed Uncle Ben and how he felt about it and what he did there, but he doesn't. He just generically says, "We'll get him," and "Hang in there, pal." You see what I mean when I say these two don't feel like close friends? I think a possible way to fix this and build a better connection between these two is to have Rio, Miles' mom, have a connection to Peter. I know this might sound really strange, but hear me out. Rio learned that Peter is Spider-Man off screen, and not a whole lot came from that. Seriously, the scenes where she's talking with him about Miles' disappearance would play out the exact same way whether she knew who he was or not. Keep in mind, the whole reason her son even became Spider-Man was because he worked at Feast, a job he only got because Rio spoke to Peter. And yet now that Miles is a superhero under Peter's tutelage, and Rio knows this, she doesn't really talk to him at all. I don't know exactly what their relationship could look like, but I feel like there should be something here. We still have one more major character to cover. Everyone's favorite. When discussing Mary Jane in the Insomniac Games, the first thing that comes to mind are the bits where you have to play as her. But before discussing the playable MJ sections, it's important that we look at MJ as a character, and to do that, we have to look at the original MJ as she was in the OG 616 comic books. Introduced as a fun party girl, Mary Jane was immediately different from other women in Peter's life. Where others would shriek at the idea of Spider-Man, MJ thought Spider-Man was cool. As Mary Jane made more appearances, her fun personality made her a real head-turner. But after the death of Gwen Stacy, MJ starts to get more serious and her layers start to get peeled back. We learn of Mary Jane's house life, how her mother and older sister were tied down with children, forced to raise a family and abandon any other desires they might have had. This is MJ's biggest fear, and she puts on her fun-loving party girl persona as a mask to face away from it and hide the sadness she endured growing up. Both Peter and MJ are people wearing masks, dealing with the respective traumas of their lives. And once the two got together, they made a really fun couple. MJ's career as an actress allowed for some fun subplots, due in part to how it's a profession we don't get to see a whole lot of in the superhero genre. As their relationship grew, they each became the most important person in each other's lives. Peter's love for Mary Jane is so strong that it single-handedly brought him back from the grave in the iconic story Kraven's Last Hunt. So you can see why these two would be drawn to each other, why they would work so well together, and why their love was so powerful it took the literal devil to drive them apart. None of what I just said applies to Insomniac's version of Mary Jane. Insomniac's MJ is not a very engaging character. She's nice, she wants to do the right thing, and yep, that's it. In 2018, she had her conflict with Peter, which was poorly handled and incredibly annoying, but at least it was something. Without it, there's not much to her. And to show you what I mean by that, let me ask you a very simple question. Who is Mary Jane outside of Peter? She doesn't have any friends or family that we know of. She pretty much only talks to Peter or people related to Peter. Even her job as a reporter has her work for a man that Peter used to work for. All of her playable sections exist only to have her help Peter. MJ has nothing going on in her life outside of supporting Peter. The game tries to comment on this by having her complain as a brainwashed monster about her job and having to help Peter all the time, but it's not enough to simply acknowledge these problems, you have to fix them, which this story doesn't really do, as the game ends with Mary Jane still being the main breadwinner of the couple, now with her own podcast as Peter works on his hobby in the garage. Still not sure why this is portrayed as a good thing. Essentially, this MJ is Peter's equivalent to Genki. Both of them exist only to support their respective Spider-Man and have no real character or purpose outside of that. The only differences between them are that Mary Jane has more screen time and is playable. Oh, and MJ gets a symbiote attached to her and fights Peter. Scream is a development that comes out of nowhere and disappears just as suddenly. I've never been a big fan of any of the Life Foundation symbiotes, so I need to stress that I am fine with MJ being Scream, though I don't think that Scream was used in an interesting way. There's no real reason for her to be called Scream, the name is never even said aloud. The design and name are an Easter egg, nothing more. So I'm not upset by this, but I don't really like it either, it just kind of is. Once she becomes Scream, it's clear what the intention is. Scream is used as a way for Mary Jane to vent her frustrations about her life and Peter. It doesn't work for 3 reasons. Firstly, we know that the symbiote is capable of making people act in ways they never would otherwise. Even Mary Jane catches when the symbiote is making her flat out lie.
That's not true.
So it's hard to believe that any of the stuff she says is true. The second is the lack of setup. MJ apparently hates her job now, even though she wanted it so bad in the first game that she repeatedly almost died for it. Even in this game, she's desperate to make it work and gets upset when she doesn't get her story published. But after one discouraging Skype call from Jameson, she wants to quit. Thirdly, just like the first game, the conflict between Mary Jane and Peter is lopsided due to the developers being unwilling to give Peter any negative traits. In the first game, it was difficult to take MJ's side because Peter wasn't being overbearing or overprotective. He was actually supportive of her work, even giving her the lore gadget to help her out. So when she lashes out at him for the Charles Standish situation that was a complete misunderstanding, the blame of the situation falls entirely on MJ since she's the one being unreasonable. Something similar happens here where Mary Jane is mad at Peter for not being able to pull his weight and not being supportive of her and her goals. But he is. He tries his hardest to get a job and is only ever kind and encouraging to her whenever she brings up her work. So the issue is not that Peter is an unsupportive boyfriend, the issue is that Mary Jane can't communicate her feelings properly. Okay, now we can talk about the bits where you play as her. The sections where you're forced to play as Mary Jane are significantly improved over the ones from Spider-Man 2018. Levels are more open, allowing players to tackle objectives in ways that suit them instead of being forced into the one correct solution needed to progress. MJ's toolset is improved as well. She starts with both the lure gadget and the world's loudest stun gun. As the game progresses, she eventually upgrades her stun gun to a web gun and then a sonic gun to deal with the symbiotes. This changes her gameplay into more of a third-person shooter, and it handles quite well. She can dodge to quickly get away from enemy fire, and she can take an additional hit before dying, which wait. She took an arrow to the chest and just walked it off? This isn't gameplay, this is a cutscene. Peter gets stabbed once and dies, and Mary Jane just rips out an arrow like it's nothing? Okay. Another thing that I don't think many will even notice is that the context behind these missions is different as well. In 2018, MJ threw herself into the most dangerous situations imaginable, which made her look more stupid than brave, part of why a lot of people simply did not like her as a character. But here, these sections are forced upon her. She engages in these activities not because she's a reckless thrill seeker, but because she needs to in order to survive. This is a more subtle distinction, but it does make the character a lot less frustrating. And lastly, there are far fewer of these, a measly 3 compared to the original's 5. Altogether, these changes make the MJ sections more palatable, but I still don't like them. The problem with the MJ segments wasn't that they were boring, slow, and derivative stealth sections. The problem was that you had to play as MJ. As I established earlier, this version of MJ isn't a very likable or exciting character, so on that alone, I do not want to play as her. But really the issue is that this is a superhero game. I don't want to play as someone who is not a superhero. This is a viewpoint that really shouldn't need to be defended. When you play a fighting game, you're going to be fighting pretty much all the time. When you play a shooter, you're going to be shooting pretty much all the time. So when I play a superhero game, it shouldn't be unreasonable to expect that I should be a superhero all the time. Side quests are exempt from this, as those are literally made to be diversions from the main gameplay. But when it comes to the main campaign, I should be doing superhero stuff the whole time. I do not want to play as a normal human being in stealth and or third-person shooter sections. If I wanted to play a stealth game or a survival horror shooter, there are plenty of fantastic games that I could go to for that. But if I want to play a Spider-Man game on modern hardware, there aren't too many great options. Believe me, I have tried. So originally I had a quick, lighthearted segment here about Mary Jane's face looking strange in this game, but because of recent information that's come out, I feel like I sort of have to re-record this and really tackle the situation with the seriousness it deserves. So if you don't know, Stephanie Tyler Jones, the face model for Mary Jane, recently put out a statement that she has been harassed by fans, so much that she has actually quit the industry. I shouldn't have to tell you that harassing people that work on games and movies that we all love and enjoy is a terrible thing to do. I can't even understand the mentality that would lead a person to do that. So that's really awful to see that happened to her. And to address her face specifically, we also now know that she was in a car crash and they had to reconstruct her jaw, which is why her face looks different compared to how it did in the first game. Now, with all that being said, I feel like I still have to say that I think Mary Jane looks really weird in this game. Sometimes, anyway. Sometimes she looks alright. Actually, sometimes she looks a lot better than she did in the first game, but sometimes she looks really odd. And I think it's two main reasons as to why Mary Jane looks odd. The first is that through a combination of factors, Mary Jane looks a lot older than the character should be. The character is like 25, 26, somewhere there, but her mannerisms, her voice, and her wardrobe are all those of a person that is at least a decade older. And when you put her next to Peter, whose new face looks a lot younger than his original one did in 2018, that only serves to age her up even more. And the other big reason why I think Mary Jane looks so strange, it has to be the uncanny valley. Like there's something there where she just does not look right. So do I think Mary Jane looks weird in this game? Without question. Do I think that anyone working on this game deserved to be harassed for that? Absolutely not. No. And while we're on this topic of weird looking faces, I'd also say that Jameson looks really strange. Like his face is too puffy. He's not nearly as good looking as his portrait was in 2018. Anyway, let's get back to the stuff that matters. Now that I've gone over all the major characters, we can discuss the game's true antagonist. I wouldn't call Venom the main antagonist, as that would mean he's the main threat for the entire game, which isn't true. Final antagonist is more like it, as Kraven takes up much of the narrative space and Venom only steps in at the end to be the final boss. This version of Venom, oh my god, he's really bad. Positives first. He looks really cool, his design is great, and he's animated very well. His voice is also so damn good. You get to play as him too for less than 20 minutes, so that was nice. And that's all the good things I have to say about him. So Harry's goal in life is to heal the world, a very vague sentiment, but he really is just trying to make the world a better place. The symbiote twists this mission statement to fit its own goals of covering the world in symbiotes. And he's just the lizard from the first Amazing Spider-Man movie. He's a big, stupid monster that wants to turn everyone into the same thing he is because he thinks it'll make everyone better. Except he's worse than the lizard, because at least he made an actual case for why he wanted to do this. Venom doesn't, and Peter never makes an argument against him either. He never says that the symbiotes will rob people of free will and make the world a worse place. All Peter ever says is, we gotta get that thing off of you, and Venom's just kinda like, I'm gonna heal the world, and that's it. That's their whole conflict. Venom is just a big dumb monster that wants to take over the world.
It's so dumb.
It's so dumb, it's brilliant.
No! It's just dumb!
They also try to have a little bit of conflict between Peter and Harry by having Harry be jealous of Peter, but like I said earlier, this comes out of nowhere and doesn't really factor into the story too much. It feels like a holdover from a different version of the script that no longer makes sense in the final story. The common defense for this Venom is that he's a new take on the character and that people only dislike him because he's not exactly like his original comic counterpart. So let's break this down. To start with, I will admit that part of the reason I don't like this Venom is that he isn't anything like what the character was in the comics. This isn't my entire reasoning for it, but I'd be lying if I said that it wasn't part of it. I'm a big Venom fan, so yeah, I wanted something that was evocative of the character in the books. But what is Venom like in the books? Well, in my opinion, when it comes to Venom, there are 4 different roles the character can fill, 4 different angles you can take with him, 4 different core traits he can have that explain who he is and why he does what he does. The first role is that of a psychotic stalker. This is how Venom was first portrayed, and it's probably the most popular version. The combination of the symbiote's strength, knowledge of Peter's personal life, and its ability to bypass Peter's spider sense made Venom a uniquely dangerous and terrifying foe. Unlike most villains, Venom could strike Peter whenever, wherever, and there was very little Peter could do about it. This version of Venom exists only to torment Peter, and he loves doing this. He has a sick sense of humor, usually centering around his perverse obsession with killing Spider-Man. The second angle is that of the goofy anti-hero. This is the role Venom took on after he started his path to redemption. Thinking that what he's doing is the right thing, Venom engages in bizarre and sadistic behavior that would be seen as completely demented if not for the fact that he's usually doing these things to criminals and supervillains. As a result, Venom's silliness and more sinister sense of humor is more prominent here. A perfect example of this role for Venom is his appearance in the PlayStation 1 Spider-Man game. In that game, Venom legitimately thinks he's doing the right thing. He believes that Spider-Man stole technology from a science expo and needs to be punished for his crimes. So Venom's kooky solution to this is to kidnap Spider-Man's wife and put her in a death trap to force Spider-Man to come and fight him, because to him, that's a totally rational strategy that makes perfect sense. The third angle is that of the dark reflection of Peter. Peter stands as the ultimate symbol of responsibility, so this Venom stands as the ultimate symbol of irresponsibility. A person who can't take responsibility for their actions, instead choosing to blame their misfortunes on anyone and everything around them. The most obvious example of this angle is Spider-Man 3's version of Venom. In that movie, he's a sleazy scumbag with no redeeming personality traits, largely because this version's personality was primarily inspired by the Ultimate Comics version of Venom, who also fills this role. Both of these versions of Venom directly parallel Peter, being as scummy and self-serving as Peter is selfless and heroic. Of these 3, I only find the first 2 to be interesting. The third one is something that does make sense, and maybe someone could make it work in the future, but so far I haven't really seen any take on this angle that I really like. Though ideally, Venom should be composed of all of these traits. A psychotic stalker born out of an inability to take responsibility for his failures, but one with a twisted sense of honor and humanity that leaves the door open for redemption. Now, you might have noticed that this is a strange place to give a little roundup, since I did mention that there are 4 different angles to take, and that's right. The fourth angle is the evil goop monster. Some evil goop fell on him and he became an evil goop monster. That's all. This is by far the least interesting version of the character, and guess which one this game goes with. I've gone through all of this without mentioning Eddie Brock. In the comics, Eddie Brock is the host of the Venom symbiote. He's also the guy you see in most adaptations of Venom, though not all of them. And the reason I haven't mentioned him until now is that I wanted to show that it isn't really about Brock specifically when it comes to Venom. Any character could be a good Venom if given the proper setup to properly take on the role and challenge Peter. It's just that Brock already has the motivation, backstory, and personality to create Venom since he is the original version of the character. The inherent problem with removing Eddie Brock from the symbiote equation is that the version of Venom you end up with is nearly always going to be the fourth version. Now, to be fair, there are versions of Venom that keep Eddie Brock and still fall into this category. I'm not saying that Eddie is an inherently better choice and that no other option is possible. What I'm saying is that replacing the symbiote's host with someone else requires a lot more narrative and character justifications to make up for what is lost. It's this extra work that this game's version of Venom does not have. The next thing to discuss is that Insomniac's version of Venom is not an original creation. Venom being a childhood friend of Peter's is taken from the Ultimate comics. Venom being Harry specifically is taken from the Ultimate cartoon. Harry being sick was already done in The Amazing Spider-Man 2. Venom initiating a symbiote takeover of New York was already done in Web of Shadows. Everything done with Venom here has been done before somewhere else. So while this take may be new in the sense that it's a new combination of previously existing ideas, it is not, in and of itself, a new take. And when it comes to new takes on a character, I'm actually quite open to that. That's why I think the symbiote should have gone to Miles instead. That would have been a new spin on the story, and it would have allowed for new things to be done with Venom as well. In the comics, the symbiote copied Peter's powers, which is why Venom is able to do all the things that he does. They could have taken this a step further had the symbiote gone to Miles. It could copy his invisibility and Venom powers, maybe even taking its name from the Venom powers. That would have been new and different and cool, something I could have really gone behind. But enough of that, let's get back to the goopy black turd we did get. Some of you may have gotten upset with me dismissing this version of Venom as a mindless monster hellbent on taking over the world. See, a lot of people argue that Harry is the one with control over Venom, with his worldview being warped by the symbiote, and not the symbiote in control puppeting Harry around for its own needs. So let's discuss this, because this is pretty interesting. Is Harry in control? I would argue no. I have two main pieces of evidence to support my claim. The first is that I think we can see exactly when Harry is in control and when he's not. When Venom first forms, he's completely non-verbal until the arrival of Kraven. If Harry was the one in control here, then wouldn't he be speaking instead of behaving like a mindless monster? That's why I think it's the symbiote in control during this section. Once Kraven shows up, Venom starts to talk to him and the subtitles credit him as Harry. So I think that Harry's brain starts to wake up at this point, fully becoming aware once Kraven is killed. I believe that Harry is the dominant personality from this point up to the confrontation with Mary Jane at Aunt May's. This is where Venom gets his name, and after this we don't see Harry again until the finale. So I think that once Venom names himself, Harry disappears and the symbiote becomes the dominant controlling force. The second piece of evidence that I have to support this is that in the finale, when the symbiote is peeled back to show Harry's face, the emotion Harry expresses is confusion. He has no idea what's going on. Dude has not been in control for a while. Like I said, the symbiote's been at the wheel since his encounter with MJ, and once he's freed up, Harry starts protesting against the symbiote's actions. What more do you want to show that Harry isn't in control? The most obvious counterpoint to my argument is that Venom speaks as if he is Harry. He reminisces about his time with Peter in high school, he goes out of his way to try and get Peter on his side, and he expresses anger at his father for not accepting him. If this is the symbiote in control, then why would it care about any of this? Part of me wants to say that the symbiote is more like a parasitic body snatcher that aims to fully replace its host, using its host's memories and personality as a base for its existence. So Venom does all these things because it's accessing Harry's memories and trying to become him. That's what part of me says. Another part says that this is simply bad writing, the writers being unsure of whether they wanted the symbiote to be evil mind-controlling goop with its own agenda, or if Harry should have actual reasons to be angry with Peter and his father, therefore turning to the symbiote as a way to do what he truly wants. Unsure of what direction to go in, they went with both, and the end result is messy. Now I'm just going to ramble on for a while about smaller issues that bothered me about the symbiote storyline, and then after that we'll get to the game's finale. All the characters are way too relaxed when the symbiote first appears. Both Peter and Miles sort of shrug off this super evil looking unexplainable black mass, and it's extremely strange. When Peter and Harry have their sleepover, they say they're going to test out the symbiotes, but they don't. They really don't. Because if Peter had used any of the tech at that facility to run tests on the symbiote, he would have found out that it's a living creature, and he would have freaked out about it, and the rest of the story wouldn't be able to happen. So instead, they just vaguely screw around for a bit before going to sleep. And I know this might sound like a super whiny, nitpicking thing, but Peter is a scientist. He should be interested in examining what the symbiote is. I think it's out of character that he doesn't. Harry is able to turn the suit into a very intricate set of tactical armor despite having very little control over the symbiote's abilities. How does that work? The appearance of Peter's symbiote suit changes to show the symbiote's progression as it takes more of a hold over Peter's mind. I don't love this idea because I've seen it done before in a much better way. The Spectacular Spider-Man cartoon was the first adaptation to have the symbiote progress in design as it took hold of Peter's mind. It worked in that show because the symbiote started out as a black recolor of the classic suit, visually starting close to Peter's usual appearance. Then it transforms into essentially the classic black suit from the comic books. So the contrast between Peter's normal appearance and this one is striking. Even if you knew nothing about the symbiote or Spider-Man in general, you could still tell that his appearance has changed to be more frightening and uncanny. But if you do know your Spider-Man material, then you get even more out of this. In the comics, the symbiote's suit design was random and not at all explained, but the show recontextualizes that design into a symbol of the alien costume's true nature and its control over its host. In this game though, Peter starts with the classic symbiote costume design, which is now, once again, a random design that doesn't have any meaning behind it. Then it transforms into a second, different random design. This design is largely retained with Venom, so I guess this is the symbol of the alien's true nature? Except it's not, because Venom gets a super form in the final boss that has another different random design. It also helps that Spectacular had a longer stint with the suit, so it gradually morphed from one form to the next, unlike in this game where the suit hard shifts into its second form. It actually makes me question if the second form of the symbiote suit was a later addition because of how random it feels. No one ever comments on how his suit's appearance has changed, and in the credits sequence, this version of the symbiote suit is never seen, even in images that directly recreate moments from the story that feature that suit. At first, the story pretends that the symbiote is a man-made exosuit developed by Connors, with the fact that it's an alien symbiote being a surprise later on. This is one of the strangest decisions in the story. I'm sure it was done in an attempt to take audiences by surprise, but I feel like general audiences are only familiar with the symbiote being an alien, as seen in the movies, so I think most would suspect that it's an alien to start with, making the reveal that it is an alien sort of pointless because the reveal is that it's exactly what you thought it was. And the game doesn't even commit to the misdirect because the suit's abilities are still labeled as symbiote abilities long before the story reveals that it's an alien symbiote. What does the symbiote eat? It's never stated that it needs anything from its host, and it often creates a ton of mass out of nothing. How is it doing this if it's not taking in more mass? There's a bit where the symbiote takes control of Peter's body while he's asleep. This is an obvious reference to the symbiote doing the same thing in the comic books. It's a neat reference, but I found its execution to be really silly. Sleeping symbiote Spider-Man growls and roars loudly like a big dumb animal, and I didn't find it cool or scary at all. Again, I think this was done a lot better in the Spectacular Spider-Man cartoon. In that show, the symbiote was completely silent when piloting Peter's unconscious body. There's something fundamentally unsettling when a character known for their constant light quips becomes completely silent. This idea is then taken to the extreme with the symbiote, its wordless actions feeling incredibly creepy and inhuman. You get the feeling that whatever is in control of Spider-Man is something cold and unknowable. But here it just looks like Peter's tweaking out of his mind. I'm sure a lot of people will disagree with me on this one, but I found this whole sequence to be pretty goofy. I feel as though the word symbiote is misused in this game. A symbiote is any organism that is in a symbiotic relationship. Yet Connors says, "We call it a symbiote," as if it's a term he made up and not a real descriptive word that's existed for over 100 years. At one point, Peter says that people are being turned into symbiotes, but that's not how that works. People get symbiotes attached to them. They're not turning into symbiotes. The character Null from the comic books is heavily visually referenced to the symbiote designs in this game, and it serves no actual purpose. It's only an aesthetic choice. Null himself is never mentioned, and it doesn't even make sense since this imagery creates more questions than it's worth. Why do all the symbiotes have the Null swirl on them, but Venom doesn't? He's their leader here on Earth, so shouldn't they all be made in his image? Scream looks like Venom too, but then again, why does she? Shouldn't she have the swirl? Shouldn't Venom have the swirl? Venom gets wings at a certain point, and once again, it doesn't mean anything. It's just there because it looks cool. It's especially odd because of how prominent the Null imagery is. See, in the comics, it was revealed that the symbiote's logo was a subconscious recreation of Null's logo, adapting his chest armor's image of a dragon into one of a spider. So when Venom grows wings in the comics, they sprout out of his logo, coming full circle and fulfilling its original dragon imagery. But here he just sprouts wings and that's it. The meteorite that the last third of the game revolves around is never given an actual name. It's only ever called the meteorite. Even Venom, the guy who should know what it is since he brought it to Earth with him, just calls it the meteorite. What, you couldn't give it a proper name, like the seed or something? Was Harry ever told that the symbiote was an alien? Maybe Mary Jane told him about it off screen prior to the scene where Harry is taking pills, but we don't get to see this, and Harry never acts any differently from that point on, so did she tell him? It doesn't look like anyone ever told him about how it affects your mind either. Like I said before, it changes Peter's behavior to a ludicrous degree and even puppets his body around while he was asleep. Did anyone ever tell Harry about that? Peter tells Harry that it made him lose himself, which is a funny way to describe completely overwriting your personality to the point that you're an active threat to your loved ones, but okay. The symbiote attaching to Spider-Man and then going to Venom doesn't really serve a purpose in this version. In the comics, attaching to Peter first let the symbiote acquire Peter's knowledge and powers, so when it transferred to Eddie, he could make use of those things as Venom to battle Spider-Man. But that doesn't happen here. A big part of the reason Peter becomes weirdly possessive of the symbiote and tries to keep it is the idea that it makes him a better Spider-Man. In the narrative, it does help him defeat the Lizard and Kraven, so there is some merit to this claim. But in terms of gameplay, I can't say that I felt the same way. The symbiote gives you two different gameplay additions, the symbiote abilities and surge mode. The symbiote abilities are only marginally better than the normal ones, and when it comes to surge mode, again, I didn't use it that much. So I didn't feel the same pull that Peter felt when it came to the suit. Now, I know that many will shrug this off as common ludonarrative dissonance, aka the conflict between what the game's story is saying and what the gameplay is saying. But a better game wouldn't have this dissonance. The gameplay and story would be working together as one to fully invest the player in what's happening, which is not the case here. Now that I think about it more, part of my issue of how the symbiote works in gameplay is that even with it, Peter is still not as strong as he was in the first game. The combination of stronger gadgets, suit powers, suit mods, and scrapped abilities like doing 2 takedowns for 1 focus bar made Peter insanely powerful in 2018, and nothing the symbiote has compares to that level of strength. I find it a little strange that the symbiote bears no ill will towards Norman or Connors for holding it in captivity for years. You'd think that would cause a bit of tension between the symbiote wanting to kill them and Harry not wanting to or something, but no. I also think it's an odd decision to make the symbiote responsible for the loss of Connor's arm. It ties the two characters together in a pretty significant way, and you'd think there'd be more to that, but no, it's pretty much just a fun fact. Harry obviously has some kind of PTSD from being in the medical tank he was in. At Coney Island, he refuses going into the dunk tank. At the steel mill, he has a vision of being in the tank. Hell, the game opens with him in the tank, yet this is never really elaborated on. Harry and Kraven have some very direct parallels that I feel like really could have been built upon. Both of them have incurable diseases and are facing death directly, each deciding to do something different with it. Harry trying to embrace life as much as he can and make the world a better place, and Kraven trying to die in what he sees as being a worthy death. This is nice subtext, but I wish it was text. At one point, Kraven says to Venom/Harry, "You don't know what it's like to watch your body betray you," but Harry does know what that's like. But he doesn't say anything. And the last thing I'll mention here is that Venom doesn't have a reason to call himself that. The scene where he says his name for the first time is built up like a huge dramatic reveal, yet it lacks any real impact because there's no significance to it. Really, this is the only proof I need to show that this is a pretty bad version of Venom. Now let's discuss the finale. Venom has taken hold of the city with his army of symbiotes. Our 3 main heroes band together to stop him. The plan is to get the meteorite to the Emily May Foundation's particle accelerator to destroy it and end the symbiote threat for good. The final section is split into 3, each major playable character getting something to do. We start with the playable MJ section, getting the worst of it out of the way first. Then we have Peter versus Venom, Peter versus Harry, his best friend. The battle takes place at Midtown High, the place where Venom says they became best friends. Even though Harry says they've known each other since 5th grade, ignore that I guess. This fight looks great, it's challenging, and the music is phenomenal. I wholeheartedly believe that this is one of the best final boss tracks I've ever heard. It's that good. Everything in terms of presentation is stellar here. But then you start thinking about things. Even at this point, I feel as though I don't really know Harry. The game tries, it really does, to rectify that here. Venom mentions all these experiences that Harry has had with Peter, lines that are delivered phenomenally by Tony Todd, but they fall flat. They fall flat because of how transparent they are. As I said, this is the writers trying to justify this, and that's all I see. I don't see 2 real people discussing their past. I see a writer's room scrambling to try and make the sequence work. Peter has gotten a power-up in the form of the anti-Venom suit. Like in the first game, Peter is locked into this suit for the entirety of the finale. Unlike the anti-Ox suit from the first game, the anti-Venom suit doesn't quite hit the same. The anti-Ox suit was the result of Peter using the same material that created Doc Ock's arms to create a suit strong enough to help defeat him. It was a symbol of Peter and Spider-Man's talents coming together to stop Ock. The anti-Venom suit isn't any of that. The anti-Venom suit is created after Miles and Martin Lee poke their heads into Peter's mindscape, so the suit serves as a triumph for Miles, not for Peter. This fight with Venom ends with Peter losing in a cutscene, so Venom flies him over to the Emily May Foundation, and we transition to the real final battle of the game, Miles versus Venom. This is the last bit of gameplay you get against Venom, who is truly defeated in a cutscene after a handful of QTEs. I really have to stress this. This is the finale of the game. Miles fighting a guy he barely knows inside of a building he's never been to before, all while wearing his new suit that has practically no reason to exist, let alone be worn here. The gang managed to come out on top. Venom is defeated, the meteorite destroyed, and Harry's life is saved by Miles. Though Harry is now comatose, something that causes Norman to hold a grudge against both Spider-Men. Mary Jane starts her podcast, Peter starts rebuilding Emily May out of his garage, and passes the role of main Spider-Man to Miles. That's where the story ends. Except not really, because there's 2 post-credit scenes. Norman proposes a team up with Octavius, and Rio introduces Miles to her new boyfriend, who has a daughter named Cindy Moon. So the big issue that everyone has been talking about in regards to this ending is Peter retiring as Spider-Man. Personally, I'm very conflicted on the story beat. In the comics, Peter has quit being Spider-Man like a billion times. So a lot of people have mindlessly pointed to that in order to say, he did it in the comics, so it's fine here. The thing is though, usually whenever Peter quit, it was framed as a bad thing, a mistake he would eventually correct. But there have been times where it was framed as a more positive thing. In these instances, there's a concrete reason as to why he quit being Spider-Man. Usually it's that he has kids. That's a pretty understandable reason to hang up the webs. Other times it's simply that he's now too old to continue doing the job. Here though, he's not old, he doesn't have kids, so his reasoning for this little sabbatical doesn't feel as strong. He does have a reason. His life has been pretty hard recently, losing loved ones and employment. In other words, typical Spider-Man activities, so why is he quitting? But at the same time, I'm not opposed to this because I know he'll come back in the next one anyway. What I do have an issue with is passing the torch to Miles. Like I said earlier, Miles starts this game on equal footing with Peter, and we never get to see Peter teach him anything, so it doesn't feel like Miles has actually grown that much. If anything, it feels as though Peter has regressed from the first game in order to make Miles look better. The setups for future titles are also underwhelming. In general, the teases feel far more on the nose here. Norman's line asking for a serum to be prepped might as well be, I'm going to be Green Goblin in the next one. The Cindy Moon reveal is silly because she shows up with no prior explanation for the sake of getting people to point the screen and Soyjack. I can't say I'm excited for either of these ideas. Norman's character up to this point has been fairly removed from Peter, so I don't feel as though they'll have a strong personal connection when they eventually face each other. And I don't think Norman has ever even seen Miles, let alone spoken to him. Cindy will most likely be completely reinvented, as almost nothing from her comic origin will really fit into this world. And in terms of personality, I'm sure she'll be another well-meaning, nice protagonist with no real character traits outside of that. How exciting. And that was the story. Needless to say, I didn't like it very much. I don't think it's anywhere near as good as the story from the first game. In fact, I would say it's not even as good as the story from Miles Morales. That game's story was mediocre, nothing special, but this one actually pisses me off. The story of this game has problems, and not minor annoyances, but large fundamental problems. I think one of the biggest issues with the story is how it lacks more quiet and personal moments with the characters. This is part of why the story in the first game worked so well. It really felt like we got to know these people. But because Spider-Man 2 is rushing from set piece to set piece, it doesn't have the time to do this. Which leads me to the other main issue with the story. There's simply too much going on. Harry and Peter's friendship, Peter and Mary Jane's relationship going through the ringer again, Miles progressing as Spider-Man, Kraven's hunt, Mr. Negative's redemption, the return of the Lizard, the birth of Venom, an alien takeover of the city. There's so much here, and none of it gets the focus that it should. You might have noticed that I didn't discuss the Lizard in this game at all, and that's because there isn't much to say. He's not really a character, he's just a big dumb monster, and Connors might as well just be scientist guy number 3. But he could have been so much more. They could have delved deeper into his family and how Connors feels about that, or played up his prior encounter with Spider-Man and how that affected him. But there's no time. Even the symbiote plotline, which should be the main narrative of the game, gets shafted to make room for Kraven, which is a shame since the symbiote stuff is way more interesting, but still ends up being disappointing because of how underdeveloped it is. While playing this game, I couldn't help but think about how I've already played a much better Marvel game this year about a guy named Peter saving the world from a mind-altering alien. The game I'm referring to is 2021's Guardians of the Galaxy. I'm going to make a few comparisons here, which means spoiling Guardians, so spoiler warning, though I don't think that really matters. Every reviewer on the planet gave this game a positive review when it came out, and people still didn't buy it, so I doubt my endorsement will change your mind. But if it does, spoiler warning. In Guardians, the villain takes hold of people's minds by trapping them in the Promise, an illusion that gives the person a perfect life and, more importantly, reunites them with lost loved ones. One of the best sequences of the game occurs when the team goes into Drax's mind to free him from his promise. The group have to hunt him down, and once they find him, they have a very sobering conversation about love and loss, eventually getting him to realize that the promise is a lie, that there's nothing that will bring his family back, and that he needs to move on. Seeing Drax accept this, to truly accept the loss of his family, is a very touching moment. Spider-Man 2 has a similar sequence of going into a character's mind to free them from the hold of an evil alien force, but it's nothing like this. Miles just sort of pops into Peter's head and is like, "Bro, wake up." And that's all we get of that. The other comparison I want to make is how the game handles dead moms. Guardians of the Galaxy opens with a flashback showing us Star-Lord's mom, Meredith Quill. We get a few more flashbacks with her and really get to know her as a person. She's cool. She tries to relate to her son and be a cool mom, but is also capable of putting her foot down when she needs to. She has an interest in music, and we learn that she was maybe a little rebellious too when she was her son's age. We get to know her and feel Star-Lord's love for her. And then we see her die. That's why when we see her again in Star-Lord's Promise, when he has to shoot her to break out of it, it's heartbreaking. Now let's look at Emily Osborn. You know, the person who is the whole reason Harry does literally anything. How many times do we get to see her? Oh, that's right. Never. We never get to know Emily as a person. We only get to know the idea of Emily Osborn. But who was she? I mean, who was she really? The game presents her as a perfect angel that wanted to make everything better, but she can't have been that perfect. She married Norman Osborn, for God's sake. The symbiote mimics her voice to get Harry on board with the plan to turn the world into the hashtag Venom Nation, and I still think this is an interesting idea. But that's all it is, an interesting idea. It never evolves past that because we only see the symbiote do it once, and we never see Emily Osborn in the flesh. So yeah, go play Guardians of the Galaxy. Now with all the story stuff out of the way, we can move on to the side content, the additional activities that will hold your interest after the credits roll. Random crimes are the activity you'll probably find yourself in the most in the open world. Of course there is the standard enemy encounter, but what about the other crimes? Well, car chases have been simplified to a single button press with no enemy encounter afterwards. Bomb crimes have completely disappeared. Finding kidnapped civilians has disappeared. The protect the van crime from Miles Morales isn't here either. Instead, there's mainly normal enemy encounters. Sometimes enemies from a different faction will jump in mid-encounter to spice things up, so that's kinda cool. As far as I can tell, there are only two new activities, fire crimes and having to carry an injured man to the hospital. Fire crimes have either a building or an oil tanker set on fire and you have to web up the fire to stop it. The tanker ones have a time limit, but the burning buildings don't. Either way, it's pretty easy to put out the fire. After that, it's a pretty normal enemy encounter. Carrying an injured civilian isn't an activity by itself, but it's something that can happen at the end of a crime. It's the same character model every time, which is kind of silly. I don't really like this one since it locks off half your traversal abilities and there's no urgency to it. I understand that they can't have the guy die in your arms, but they could have had a bonus objective to get him to the hospital within a certain time frame. Surprised as I am to say it, I think the crimes have taken a step down from the first game. One thing I will praise them for though, is the replayability. See, in the first game, you had to complete 5 crimes for each enemy faction to clear each district. But once you did this, all the different faction crimes would stop happening and only the default thugs would appear. This game actually fixed this issue as all the enemy factions continue to appear in the post-game. Enemy bases have been reworked. To start with, there are much fewer enemy bases this time around. Only the Hunter enemy faction have bases, and in my experience, they weren't as challenging as the ones from the first game, as it seems like they have fewer enemies. But you can't go directly into a Hunter base. First, you have to clear Hunter blinds, which are fairly basic Hunter enemy encounters. After completing all the blinds in an area, the base is revealed. Each completed base rewards you with a phone call from Kraven's family. The twist at the end being that Kraven's daughter has killed the rest of the family to prove herself as the new heir. Good for her. Symbiote nests are another activity that are similar to bases, but they're not really the same. These things charge you with defending a bomb on the nest's central nerve sac as endless waves of symbiotes attack you. After surviving and protecting the bomb for a set period of time, you win. These two activities are the ones where you get to face large amounts of enemies and really test your skills. They're pretty good, and if you like the enemy bases from the first two games, you'll like these. However, for some reason, these aren't replayable. I really hope this changes with New Game Plus because I am not playing the whole game again just to do these. The photograph side activity returns from the first game, with a different spin this time. Now you take pictures of people instead of landmarks. While it is an interesting change, I do think it slows things down. Before, you could take pictures of the buildings as you were swinging, so if you knew what you were doing, you could snap the shots without slowing down. But since this game has you take pictures of people, it forces you to halt all your movement to come down to the ground and take the photos. It does let you see more of the city and the love the developers put into it, so there is that to consider, but it's also less convenient. The backpacks from 2018 have been replaced by the spider bots. There are spider bots based around different Spider-Man characters strewn throughout the city, and collecting all of them rewards you with a cutscene featuring a character that was cut from across the Spider-Verse. Pretty underwhelming, honestly. These things don't show up on the map, so you have to find them yourself. But it's not too bad since there is an upgrade that makes them show up on your mini-map, and the map does say how many are in each area. This actually could have been cool if not for the underwhelming payoff. There are a handful of side missions you can take from the Friendly Neighborhood Spider-Man app. Some can be done by either Spider-Man and some require you to use a specific one. All these app request missions are pretty short and simple, more memorable due to their story and emotional moments than anything related to gameplay. The one with Howard is the most memorable since we've known him since the first game and it's sad to see him go. My favorite one is probably the robot dog though. That mission was just so silly in its premise. The Emily May Foundation has research stations set up around the city, much like the Oscorp research stations from the first game. These activities are limited to Peter as he's the one working there. They offer a variety of tasks from watering plants to putting up floating wind turbines. Half of them revolve around this bee-drone shooter minigame. Like the research station from the first game, these are a mixed bag of activities. The reward for doing all of these is a recording from Harry and the life story suit? Harry wasn't even in the issue the suit is taken from. Miles' life story suit isn't locked behind a side quest, so why does this one? It doesn't matter. Miles has a handful of side quests related to his school, Brooklyn Visions Academy. These are all okay too, a lot of minor and low stakes stuff that really highlights how cushy this place is. You're rewarded with the Boricua suit for doing this, which is a little strange considering that the students shouldn't know that this Spider-Man is half Puerto Rican, but whatever. Miles also gets the side quest related to the museum. It involves recovering stolen items from a museum that were stolen by this guy. Cool. There's actually a lot of real-world history here, which is interesting to see. Outside of that, there are a bevy of side quests revolving around specific characters, one for Prowler, Sandman, Mysterio, Chameleon, and Wraith. The Prowler side quest has Miles go through several of his uncle's old stashes. You have to do a little mini-game with the adaptive triggers to reveal an entrance, and usually just pull it out after that. Once you get all these, it's revealed that Aaron has gone to his own apartment, co-signed by Rio. That's nice, I guess, but not nearly as exciting as I was hoping. This activity is entirely inoffensive. It's not bad so much as it is needless and underwhelming. For Sandman, there are several of his memory crystals scattered throughout the city. When you find one, you defeat a wave of Sandman goons, break the crystal, and get a recording from Sandman. This is probably the worst one. The Sandman enemies are the easiest enemy type in the game. There's very little variety among them. There's only two types of Sandman goons, the normal ones and the ones with a range move. You fight these same two guys every time, and the audio you get at the end is so banal. The only thing you learn from these is that Sandman has a daughter named Kimia. Everything else these things tell you could be inferred from the opening sequence and Kraven's arrival. That being that Kraven was hunting Sandman and he freaked out. The ending has Spider-Man drop off a statue at Kimia's doorstep, and that's it. You don't get to actually talk to her or see Sandman again. Everything about this side quest felt like filler. The Mysterio side quest is a mixed bag. After going through his Mysterium attractions in the main story, Miles is then tasked with going through several of his other setups throughout the city. These are the game's challenge missions, which spotlights an immediate problem. I just said that Miles is tasked with doing these, and I really meant that. Only Miles is able to do these challenge missions. I get that Miles and Peter aren't that different in their gameplay, but it's still extremely lame to lock this sort of thing to only only one of the playable characters. These challenges are only combat challenges. Traversal and stealth challenges don't exist here. Like I said before, I don't give a snot about stealth, but I think it's a huge missed opportunity to leave out traversal challenges. Traversal is so much better here, yet we don't get a real way to showcase our proficiency with it. The challenges we do get are mostly fine, although they're wildly unbalanced. Most of them were really easy and I managed to get a gold rank on my first try. 2 or 3 of them though were really difficult. I remember I was stuck on one of them for like an hour. Every challenge you complete gives you an audio log where former supervillain Quentin Beck bickers with his 2 business partners over their Mysterium venture. After completing all the challenges, you're invited back to Coney Island for a very underwhelming boss fight. Mysterio makes use of none of the innovations in this game's boss fight design and feels like a leftover from the first game. I guess it's fitting that Mysterio's boss fight is a visual spectacle with nothing going on under the hood. Real quick, I just want to say that I don't like this Mysterio design that much. The skull within his globe head is neat, but I think it distracts too much from the globe. His head being a giant blank circle is always a cooler visual to me. For someone who is supposed to be all about appearing larger than he is, the outfit itself is pretty restrained. It lacks the grandiose vibe that I think Mysterio should have. Where's the big flowing cape? And the outfit doesn't have enough green either, it's covered in too much dull purple. Then we get the big twist reveal that it was actually Beck's business partners behind everything. Unless I missed something, this doesn't quite add up. All the audio tapes you get from completing the Mysteriums clearly show that Beck is doing something shady, and I get it, it's supposed to be a misdirect, but there's no point where you can listen to them again and spot what's really going on. Instead, it's written in a way where it's clearly Beck at fault until the final audio log where everything takes a 180 spin and the associates are revealed to be the masterminds. And in the middle of doing these Mysterium challenges, you'll sometimes get a cryptic message. Are these messages from Beck? They must be, because he physically appears during the Mysterio boss fight in a similar way to ask for help. So did he know that they were behind this all along? Also, how did he send that last message if he was tied up in a broom closet? But the biggest thing that holds this little side story back is that Miles is the one going through this. Peter is the guy who's fought Mysterio before. Peter is the one that should be there to witness him turn his life around. Miles doesn't know this guy, so it doesn't mean as much for it to be him to see Beck go through all this. In general, I think this game does a really bad job of utilizing Peter's history with these past villains, and this is a clear example of it. Imagine if instead, every now and then after completing a challenge, Miles would call Peter and ask him his thoughts on the matter. Peter could tell him about his past encounters with Mysterio and how that went down. Maybe Peter could tell Miles that this all sounds like typical Mysterio, with Miles pushing back that maybe there's more to it, or maybe Peter could say that Mysterio's ego would have prevented these issues with the Mysteriums and that there's something else at play. I don't know. Anything to make the story feel like an actual change for a character who's been a villain in the past, instead of a guy who just spawned in. This side quest, like I said, is a mixed bag. The challenges are mostly fun, they have fun visuals, and it's cool to see Mysterio, but they've also got a middling narrative attached to them with a lackluster finale. The unidentified target mission chain tasks you with following a drone to download data off of it. These are sort of traversal challenges, but they only test your ability to use the web wings. After completing all of these missions, you go to a penthouse that's revealed to be the Chameleon's. It's also revealed that he's Kraven's half-brother and that he's still out there. Neat. The Flame is a side quest centered around investigating a dangerous cult. I like how you can encounter the cultists in the open world before engaging in this quest, since it makes you curious and want to learn more about them. This is the side quest where former police captain Yuri Watanabe debuts as the vigilante Wraith. Following her rapid turn from the first game's DLC, she's now on a very unexplained path of justice. I really mean that, they don't explain anything about her. How she got that little chain thing and became so proficient with it, how is she able to put up a fight against Spider-Man despite having no superpowers, how is Spider-Man so comfortable working with her after she killed a guy in 2018's DLC, has she killed anyone since then as Wraith? There's no time to delve into Yuri and her new Wraith persona at all, because the side quest's true purpose is to set up Carnage. The leader of the cult is Cletus Cassidy, except that's not actually his name, it's just one of the aliases he's used. The game only refers to him as the Flame, but his model sheet refers to him as Cletus Cassidy, so what was even the point of any of that? I have to say, this is one of my least favorite interpretations of Cletus Cassidy. The cult leader gimmick has been a part of Cletus' character in the comics recently, but I always preferred his simpler, unhinged psycho killer thing he had going on in his earlier appearances. He was a dangerous threat because of the massive body count he would rack up and the sheer delight he would take in doing so. But this version of Cletus is nothing like that. He's only recognizable due to his physical features. Nothing about his personality is similar to his comic counterpart. Even his cult is divorced from the nihilistic and anarchic mentality he had in the books, instead replaced by a generic doomsday prophecy cult. I never found him to be threatening either. Part of this is that he's really goofy, almost like he's a parody of cult leaders instead of an earnest attempt at one. But I think what's more important is that we never see this guy kill anybody, not even in a censored, family-friendly way where no blood is shown. We hear about how he slaughtered his last flock of followers, but we don't see any of this. All we see is a dude who wears weird shirts and hides like a coward behind his followers. Upon encountering Cassidy, Yuri tries to kill him, Spider-Man stops her, and they fight. As they fight, they have a baby's first discussion on the morality of killing people. I'm honestly shocked that Spider-Man never brings up the most obvious point against killing criminals, that being that people can change and become rehabilitated. We even have proof of that in this game with Tombstone and Martin Lee, as well as Mysterio and Sandman, though they're relegated to side quests. Cassidy gets away, which leads to the final mission. Cassidy derails an Oscorp train carrying a sample of the symbiote so he can grab it for himself. Something that kinda doesn't make sense, since if Oscorp had the separate sample, why didn't they give it to Harry in the main story? But whatever. This is pretty clearly baiting for either the sequel or a DLC. The webhead gets trapped under the train, but Yuri saves him. With that, she leaves, most likely to kill more criminals and Spider-Man's not looking. To me, this was the side quest with the highest production value, but I didn't really like it much. Neither of the two characters the side quest revolves around get much development, and I can't say that I'm excited to see either of them again. You get a pretty meh suit as a reward too. It's basically a Spider-Man version of Yuri's Wraith suit, which isn't that great either. And this isn't to say that I dislike it because it's different from the comic book one, because I don't care for that one either. Her suit in this game is a very low budget, leather jacket based super suit, like something from the Arrowverse TV shows. Anyway, those are all the side activities. To give a brief summary / overview, I think the crimes, challenges, and bases have taken a step down. There's less variety in them, and the replayability of the bases is non-existent. Collectibles are about the same. I think the side quests are generally better, even if I do have some issues with them. The only side quests I can even remember from the first game are the Tombstone and Imposter Spider-Man missions. But here, there are many more memorable side quests. Even the ones I didn't like that much, like the Carnage and Mysterio ones, are still more memorable due to the characters featured in them, and the obviously higher production value of the missions that made them feel a lot bigger than what was in the first game. Now we do have some more things to look at before we wrap up, that being smaller features like quality of life stuff and bugs. The social feed from the first game was an interesting window into the perspective of an average person living in New York City during the events of the game. Some of it was actually well written and felt authentic to interactions and exchanges that you often find on the internet. I'll admit that I completely ignored it in Miles Morales to the point that I didn't even realize it was in the game until after I had completed it. And overall, I'd say it wasn't that important of a feature. Still, it's worth pointing out that the social feed did not make it into this game. I think that's a shame, since I would have really liked to have seen the people's thoughts on the symbiote invasion at the end of the game. Character bios from the first two games were fun to dig into. I remember going through every single one of them in prior games, seeing the characters' official heights and ages, reading through their descriptions written from the perspective of Peter and Miles respectively, gave information about them just as much as it did the characters they were describing. And yet the character bios have been completely scrapped here. This game brings in several characters who really could have used some more backstory, and the perfect vehicle to deliver that has been removed. Both the J. Jonah Jameson and Danica Hart podcasts return in this game, but I can't speak to the quality of these cast content because the ability to listen to them from the pause menu has been removed. So if you miss one of these, too bad. And this is a weird one, but you can't access the settings from the start menu. You could do this in the first game, and I don't understand why you can't do it here. These little features have been removed, which is both disappointing and a little surprising since it doesn't seem like they'd be that hard to implement. One of the biggest complaints you'll find online is this game's lack of a New Game Plus feature. This is something that I'm willing to forgive them for since the first game didn't have one at launch either. Still, it's pretty strange that it's taking so long. The same could be said for the ability to change the time of day, though I hope we also get to change the weather as well, something the first game never let you do. I want to swing in the rain, dang it. However, I think this discourse has taken away from the quality of life features that have been added or improved upon. The game has a ton of accessibility options. There's plenty of options to highlight different gameplay aspects of different colors so you can see them better, like characters, enemies, environmentals, and the spider sense indicators. Photo mode has plenty of new features, like new poses, new lighting options, and, my favorite, the ability to switch costumes in photo mode. This is a great feature for detail freaks like myself to quickly swap between costumes in the same angle and lighting to see the differences between them. Another helpful feature is the shortcut keybinds. The left and right arrows on the D-pad can have specific actions assigned to them. It's really helpful for actions that require 2 button presses, as you can put them on 1 button. For example, finishers. Although, real quick, the text description for the finishers in this menu says that finishers are banked after 15 hits and subsequent ones after 10. That's not true at all. This text must be a leftover from Miles Morales since finishers only worked like that in that game. I actually use this to assign the charge jump to one of these shortcuts. When used this way, pressing the button immediately shoots them off without having to actually charge the charge jump. This sorta fixes one of the things I complained about in an earlier video. See, the charge jump's charge gets cancelled out whenever you parkour over something. That's still the case here, but with the charge jump shortcut, I can just press that right after parkouring and get an instant charge jump, so it's kind of been fixed. I can't speak to how it compares to Miles Morales since I didn't spend that much time with that game, but I can say that Spider-Man 2 is, without question, much buggier than the first game. Most of the bugs I encountered were harmless visual bugs, like the spider cube glitch, but there was a pretty consistent bug with crimes disappearing. This happened to me more after I had completed the story, and it did affect my experience. Outside of that, there weren't many issues with the game, but it is very clear that this game is much less polished than the first game was. As I close out this video, I can't help but think of a comment I got on my final livestream video covering this game. The comment read, "I can't tell if he liked the game or didn't." We live in a highly polarized world where everything is either the best thing ever or the worst thing ever, with very little room for anything in between. This mindset spawning people who take the slightest piece of criticism as complete hatred and think that any amount of praise equals complete adoration. That's why it's hard for many to accept that things can fall in between these two extremes, not just into a flat middle ground, but in a vast spectrum between best and worst. Which brings us to Marvel's Spider-Man 2. This is a good game. That statement may come as a shock since it certainly sounds like I've been mainly complaining about it this whole time, but it's true. This is a good game. Traversal has been improved in nearly every aspect. It is undeniably better than its predecessors. The increase in basic combat tools like the directional web yank and aerial slide under make Peter and Miles feel better to control than in either of their previous outings. Boss fights have seen a monumental increase in quality. Alternate costumes, both new and old, look great, with 60 plus outfits coming in with no additional cost. The PS5's capabilities allow for the best looking Spider-Man game we've ever seen. But a good thing can have bad aspects to it. Customizability in combat has taken a nosedive due to the removal of gadgets, suit mods, and suit powers. Stealth is somehow less interesting. Visual customization has taken a hit, with many previous suits being removed, Peter's mechanical arms and symbiote powers looking odd on most of his costumes, as well as an increase in moments where you are forced to wear specific outfits in the story. Quality of life features like replaying bases and rehearing podcasts have been removed, and the biggest problem of all is that the story is not nearly as cohesive or as emotionally resonant as it was in Spider-Man 2018, featuring story and character beats that are woefully underdeveloped and downright baffling at times. If I had to give Spider-Man 2 a numerical score, it would be like a 7 or 8, somewhere there. A good thing can have bad aspects, just as a bad thing can have good aspects. What determines a work's overall quality comes down to balance. Balance is one of the core themes of this game, which is ironic since it's something this game never actually achieves. I really do wish I could close this out on a more positive note, but while I do like this game, I also think it has way too many issues to ignore. Some of them may be fixed in the New Game Plus update, but I fear that many of them are here to stay. Maybe Insomniac Spider-Man 3 or Wolverine game will be better, but at this point, I'm not hopeful. Insomniac, put Morbius in the next one.